Tonight we journey into one of history's darkest chapters, a time when death arrived not with armies or earthquakes, but with something far more terrifying. Silence. The silence of deserted villages, abandoned fields, and streets where grass pushed through the cracks of forgotten stone because there was no one left to walk upon them. We are exploring the Black Death, a plague that didn't merely kill, but erased civilizations, rewrote the map of humanity, and scarred our collective memory in ways that still echo today. This was no ordinary epidemic. It was an apocalypse that crept across continents in slow motion, leaving behind a world so transformed that nothing would ever be the same again. Between 1330 and 1353, an invisible killer swept through Asia, Africa, and Europe, cutting the global population from roughly 475 million to around 350 million. These aren't just numbers. They are vanished bloodlines, silenced languages, and abandoned cities that had stood for centuries. Imagine discovering how plague wiped out humanity in ways that completely change everything we thought we knew about plague history. What you're about to hear will keep you thinking long into the night. Let's step back into a time when humanity stood on the edge of extinction. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So subscribe, maybe, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always check comments, and it's fascinating. Someone in Seoul at breakfast, someone in Chicago at midnight, all connected by curiosity about our shared human past. Kind of like how the plague connected the medieval world. Not through choice, through contagion. The disease that would reshape human civilization was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Though the people of the 14th century had no understanding of bacteria, germs, or the microscopic world that surrounded them, to them this was divine punishment, demonic possession, perhaps the end of the world itself. They were wrong about the cause. But they weren't wrong about the scale of the catastrophe. Yersinia pestis is a master of disguise and adaptation. It can survive in multiple hosts, spread through various methods, and mutate in ways that make it incredibly difficult to combat even with modern medicine. The bacterium primarily lives in rodents, rats, mice, squirrels, prairie dogs, and other small mammals. But it's the fleas that feed on these animals that serve as the delivery system for death. Here's how it works. Picture a flea. Tiny, barely visible. It bites an infected rodent and draws blood containing Yersinia pestis bacteria into its body. The bacteria multiply rapidly, so rapidly that they actually block the flea's digestive system, create a biological plug in the insect's stomach. This creates a nightmare scenario. The flea becomes desperately, frantically hungry, but it can't properly digest food. The blockage prevents it, so it bites again, and again, and again, each time regurgitating infected blood into the new wound, spreading plague with every desperate attempt to feed. One infected flea can bite dozens of times, each bite potentially delivering thousands of bacteria into a new host. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. When the rodent population dies off and plague kills rats just as efficiently as it kills humans, the fleas don't simply die with their hosts. They jump ship, seeking new sources of blood, new warm bodies to feed upon, and in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities, the most available alternative hosts were humans. We shared living spaces with rats. Our houses had thatched roofs where rodents nested. Our grain stores attracted them. Our garbage piles fed them. We lived so close to rats that the medieval mind barely registered their presence. They were just part of the landscape, part of daily life, until they started dying, and their fleas started looking for alternatives. The plague manifested in 3 primary forms, each more horrifying than the last. Bubonic plague was the most common. It attacked the lymphatic system, the network of nodes and vessels that drain fluid from tissues and fight infection. When plague bacteria entered the body through a flea bite, they travelled to the nearest lymph node. There, they multiplied. Explosively, the lymph node would swell. Massively, painfully. These swellings were called buboes from the Greek word for groin, because that's where they often appeared first. Groin, armpits, neck. Anywhere lymph nodes concentrate, the buboes could grow to the size of apples, black, festering, filled with pus and infected tissue. The pain was excruciating. Victims described feeling like they were being torn apart from the inside, like their bodies were burning. Fever came next. High fever. 104, 105, 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The body desperately trying to kill the infection through heat. But Yersinia pestis thrives in human body temperature. The fever didn't help. It just made the suffering worse. Delirium followed. Hallucinations. Some victims became violent, fighting invisible enemies. Others became catatonic, staring into nothing, the fever literally cooking their brains. Then came the vomiting. The headaches, the muscle pain so severe that some victims couldn't move, couldn't speak, just lay there shaking, burning, dying by inches. If untreated, bubonic plague killed between 30 and 75% of its victims, usually within a week, sometimes within days. Death came from septic shock, the body's immune system overreacting so violently that it destroyed vital organs in its desperate attempt to fight the infection. But at least bubonic plague gave you a chance. A slim one, but a chance. Some people survived. Their immune systems somehow mounted an effective response. The buboes would burst, draining the infected tissue. The fever would break. Slowly, painfully, they would recover. Left scarred, weakened, but alive. The other 2 forms offered no such mercy. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. It occurred when Yersinia pestis bacteria entered the respiratory system, either through breathing in infected droplets from another victim's cough, or when bubonic plague spread from the lymph nodes into the lungs. Once in the lungs, the bacteria multiplied with horrifying speed. Within 24 hours, the victim would begin coughing. At first dry, then wet, then bloody, bringing up thick, dark, infected sputum with every rattling breath. The lungs filled with fluid, with pus, with blood. The victim literally drowned from the inside, gasping for air that couldn't reach the flooded alveoli. The struggle to breathe became desperate. Panicked, every breath a battle, every cough spreading infected droplets into the air around them. And here's the nightmare: pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person. No flea required, just proximity, just breathing the same air as someone actively coughing up infected lung tissue. A single sneeze could infect everyone in a room. A cough could kill your family, your friends, anyone who came close enough to help. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague was virtually 100%. Once infected, you had 2 to 4 days, maximum, usually less. Most victims died within 48 hours of the first cough. There was no surviving it. Not with medieval medicine, not even with modern antibiotics if treatment is delayed more than 24 hours. And then there was septicemic plague, the rarest form, the fastest killer. Septicemic plague occurred when Yersinia pestis entered the bloodstream directly. Sometimes from a flea bite hitting a blood vessel, sometimes from bubonic plague spreading before the buboes even formed, sometimes from pneumonic plague overwhelming the lungs and spilling into circulation. Once in the bloodstream, the bacteria multiplied at exponential rates. Millions, billions, circulating through every organ, every tissue, everywhere. The infection triggered massive hemorrhaging. Blood vessels burst. Internally and externally, victims would develop dark patches on their skin, subcutaneous bleeding creating bruise, like discolorations that spread across their bodies, turning them black, purple, the color of death. Hence one of the plague's names, the Black Death, not just because of the buboes, but because of what septicemic plague did to the skin. Blood would leak from every orifice, nose, mouth, eyes, ears, the body quite literally bleeding out from the inside while the victim was still alive. Death came quickly, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. The mortality rate was essentially 100%. You couldn't survive septicemic plague. The bacterial load was too high, the damage too extensive. By the time symptoms appeared, you were already dead. Your body just hadn't stopped yet. These three forms, bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic, could all occur in the same epidemic, in the same city, even in the same person. Bubonic plague could progress to pneumonic. Pneumonic could become septicemic. The disease mutated, adapted, found new ways to kill. What made the Black Death so devastating wasn't just its lethality, it was its unpredictability. The disease could remain dormant in rodent populations for years, circulating among prairie dogs or marmots in some remote mountain range, killing a few animals here and there, but never breaking out into epidemic proportions. Then suddenly, triggered by climate changes or population density shifts or pure random chance, it would explode, spread to domestic rats, jump to humans, race through a city like wildfire, kill thousands, tens of thousands, then disappear again, go dormant. Wait, it could spread through trade routes, following merchants and travelers across vast distances. A merchant in Samarkand buys silk from a warehouse where rats are dying. The silk is packed in bundles, carried by camel to Constantinople, loaded onto a ship bound for Venice, unpacked in an Italian warehouse. The whole time, infected fleas hiding in the fabric, waiting. One bite, one transmission, and Venice burns with plague. The disease could hide in clothing, in cargo, in the very goods that connected the medieval world. Trade, the lifeblood of civilization, became the highway for death, and medieval people had no defense, no understanding. They couldn't see bacteria, couldn't detect infection until symptoms appeared, couldn't trace transmission routes or identify patient zero. They only knew that people were dying, everywhere, all at once. And nothing they did seemed to stop it. They tried everything their limited medical knowledge could offer: bloodletting, cutting veins to drain, bad humours, lancing the buboes to release infected fluid, burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, drinking mercury, eating emeralds ground to powder, sitting in sewers because someone theorized bad air was balanced by worse air. None of it worked because they were fighting bacteria with medieval superstition, trying to cure infection with magic and guesswork. The plague didn't care about their theories, didn't care about their prayers, didn't care about their desperate attempts to understand. It just killed, and killed, and killed. But this wasn't the first time plague had devastated humanity. The Black Death of the 14th century was the deadliest, the most famous, the one that changed everything. But it wasn't the first. Plague is ancient, far older than recorded history. It's been with us, or more accurately, with rodents for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands, circulating in wild animal populations, occasionally jumping to humans, occasionally killing enough people to leave marks in the historical record. The first well-documented plague pandemic occurred centuries before the Black Death, and it nearly destroyed the civilization that would have saved humanity had it survived intact. The year is 541 CE. The place is Pelusium, Egypt, a port city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, a bustling trade hub connecting the Mediterranean world to the riches of the East. A ship arrives from somewhere farther south, maybe Ethiopia, maybe India. The historical sources are unclear, but the ship carries something besides trade goods, something invisible, something deadly. Within weeks, people in Pelusium start dying. The symptoms are familiar to anyone who knows plague history. Swollen buboes, high fever, delirium, death within days. The disease spreads along trade routes, up the Nile, across the Mediterranean. Within months, it reaches Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest city in the Christian world, home to 500,000 people. The emperor at the time is Justinian I, a man with grand ambitions. He's been reconquering the Western Roman Empire, reclaiming territories lost to barbarian invasions, rebuilding, expanding, dreaming of restoring Rome to its former glory. And then plague arrives in his capital. This is what we now call the Plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of Yersinia pestis, and it devastates the Byzantine world. The historian Procopius, who lived through it, left us detailed accounts. His descriptions are horrifying, precise. He describes the symptoms with clinical accuracy: the buboes, the fever, the delirium, the black discoloration of the skin. He's describing the same disease that would return 800 years later as the Black Death. Procopius claims that at the pandemic's peak, 10,000 people per day were dying in Constantinople alone. That number might be exaggerated. Ancient historians loved dramatic numbers. But even if it's half true, even if it's a quarter true, we're talking about unimaginable death. The city couldn't bury the dead fast enough. Graves filled. Cemeteries overflowed. Justinian ordered the towers of the city walls hollowed out and packed with corpses. Tens of thousands of bodies stacked in stone towers, sealed, left to rot. Ships were loaded with dead and towed out to sea, dumped overboard. The ocean became a graveyard. The smell, you can't imagine the smell. In the heat of a Constantinople summer, hundreds of thousands of rotting bodies. The stench would have been visible, a haze hanging over the city, getting into everything: clothes, food, water. You couldn't escape it. Trade collapsed. Who wants to do business in a plague city? Merchants stopped coming. Ships stopped docking. The economy, the lifeblood of empire, ground to a halt. Agriculture failed. Farmers died in the fields. Crops rotted unharvested. Food shortages followed. Then famine. The plague killed directly. Starvation killed the survivors. Justinian's military campaigns stopped. You can't conquer territory when your armies are dying faster than the enemy can kill them. The dream of restored Rome ended, not because of military defeat, because of bacteria. The plague spread beyond Constantinople, throughout the Byzantine Empire, into Persia, north into Europe, south into Africa. following the same trade routes that had connected the ancient world, turning prosperity into death. Modern estimates suggest the plague of Justinian killed 25 to 50 million people between 541 and 549 CE, maybe half the population of the Byzantine Empire, maybe more, and then it faded. Not disappeared, faded, becoming endemic, flaring up in periodic outbreaks over the next 200 years, each wave killing thousands, but never again reaching the apocalyptic levels of that first outbreak. Why did it fade? We don't know exactly. Maybe rodent populations crashed. Maybe climate changes affected flea reproduction. Maybe the survivors developed some immunity. Maybe the bacteria mutated into a less virulent form. Whatever the reason, plague became less deadly, less frequent. By the 8th century, the plague of Justinian was over, but the damage was permanent. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. Justinian's dream of restoring Rome died with him. The plague had redrawn the map of power, created space for new empires to rise, changed the trajectory of Western civilization. Sound familiar? This is the pattern plague follows. It doesn't just kill people. It reshapes civilizations, ends dynasties, redirects history. The plague of Justinian wasn't the only ancient plague, just the best documented. Earlier records hint at other epidemics. The Antonine Plague of 165-180 CE devastated the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. We're not certain it was bubonic plague. Some historians think it might have been smallpox or measles. But the pattern is similar. Trade routes, rapid spread, mass death, societal disruption, 5 million dead, maybe more. The Roman Empire was never quite the same afterward. The plague of Athens in 430 BCE killed a quarter of the city's population during the Peloponnesian War. Again, we're not sure of the disease. Typhoid, typhus, Ebola, plague. The symptoms don't perfectly match any single disease. But whatever it was, it devastated Athens at a critical moment, killed their leader, Paracas, contributed to their eventual defeat by Sparta. Disease changing the course of war, changing history. These patterns repeat throughout the ancient world. Epidemics appear in Chinese records, in Egyptian records, in Indian texts. Diseases sweeping through populations, killing thousands, tens of thousands, then fading, waiting. But plague, Yersinia pestis specifically, seems to have a particular affinity for certain conditions. Trade routes, concentrated populations, poor sanitation, contact between urban centers and wild rodent populations. These conditions have existed for thousands of years. As long as humans have built cities and established trade networks, we've been vulnerable to plague. Archaeological evidence suggests plague is even older than historical records indicate. DNA analysis of ancient human remains has found Yersinia pestis in Bronze Age skeletons from 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago, long before any written plague descriptions. These ancient strains might not have been as violent as later versions. They might not have caused pandemic-level outbreaks. But they were there, in the human population, killing, waiting, evolving. Plague is patient. It can wait in rodent populations for centuries, circulating quietly, not causing human outbreaks, just surviving, adapting, occasionally mutating, and then conditions align. Climate changes, trade routes expand, human populations grow, rodent populations explode, flea reproduction increases, all these factors converging, and plague strikes. Again, the gap between the plague of Justinian and the Black Death was about 800 years. 8 centuries where plague was mostly quiet, Not absent, there are scattered references to localized outbreaks in medieval records. But nothing pandemic scale. Nothing that threatened to wipe out civilization. People forgot. The trauma of Justinian's plague faded from cultural memory, became legend. Old stories about ancient disasters, not something to worry about in the present. And then, in the early 14th century, conditions aligned again. Perfectly. Catastrophically. Climate had been changing. The medieval warm period, a time of relatively mild temperatures and stable weather, was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Colder winters, wetter summers, crop failures, famine. Famine weakens immune systems, makes populations vulnerable, and it changes rodent behavior. When food becomes scarce, rats move, migrate, seek new sources, bring themselves into closer contact with humans. Trade networks had expanded. The Mongol Empire, largest land empire in history, had connected east and west like never before. The Silk Road was thriving. Merchants travelled from China to the Mediterranean. Goods flowed, ideas flowed, and plague flowed. In the 1320s, somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, plague emerged from its rodent reservoirs, started killing humans, started spreading along those expanded trade routes. At first, it was localized, a few deaths here and there. Nothing remarkable. The kind of disease outbreak that happened regularly in the medieval world and barely got recorded. But this time was different. This time, the strain was more violent, the conditions more favorable, the network more connected. This time, plague wasn't going to fade. It was going to explode, and it was going to change everything. Picture the Tian Shan mountain range, Heavenly Mountains, in Chinese, a vast system of peaks and valleys stretching across Central Asia through what is now Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Western China. Remote, beautiful, harsh. This region has been home to wild rodent populations for millennia. Marmots, particularly. Large ground squirrels that live in vast colonies in the mountain valleys. Cute animals, furry, social. They whistle to communicate. Locals call them whistling pigs, and they carry plague. Have carried it for thousands of years. Yersinia pestis circulates through marmot populations in these mountains. Endemic, always present. Killing a few animals each season, but never wiping out the colonies. The marmots have evolved with it. Developed some resistance, enough to survive, enough to keep the bacteria alive. Local human populations knew about this. Kazakh and Kyrgyz hunters had learned not to hunt marmots that seemed sick, slow, unafraid of humans. Those were plague infected. Touch them and you'd get sick too. Maybe die. This was traditional knowledge, passed down through generations. Stay away from sick marmots. Don't handle dead ones. Be careful during certain seasons when plague flares up, and for centuries this worked. The plague stayed mostly in the marmot populations. Occasional human cases. A hunter who ignored the warnings. A family who ate infected meat. Tragic, but localized, not epidemic. Then something changed in the early 14th century. We're not entirely sure what. Climate shifts, probably. The transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age was disrupting ecosystems globally. Weather patterns changing. Temperatures fluctuating. Animals migrating to new ranges. Maybe the marmot populations exploded and then crashed. Boom-bust cycles driven by changing climate and food availability. Maybe the crash drove surviving marmots and their fleas into closer contact with other rodents, rats, mice, species that lived closer to human settlements. Maybe increased human activity in the region disrupted the usual patterns. The Mongol Empire had recently conquered Central Asia, established new trade routes, built new cities and way stations along the Silk Road, brought humans into territories that had been wild, remote. Whatever the trigger, plague jumped from wild marmots to domestic rats, from the mountains to the trade routes, from isolated cases to sustained human transmission. The first documented outbreak in human populations occurred around 1320–1330 in the Tian Shan region. Local chronicles mention a disease killing people in unusual numbers, villages dying, traders avoiding certain routes. But these are fragmentary sources, chronicles from remote regions translated multiple times. Dates uncertain, details vague. What we know more clearly is that by 1330, plague had reached China, and China at the time was the most populous, most urbanized, most connected region on Earth. The Yuan dynasty ruled China. This was the Mongol dynasty established by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. The Mongols had conquered China in the previous century. Now they ruled from Beijing, connected China to the vast Mongol Empire stretching across Asia. Chinese cities were massive. Beijing probably had over 1 million inhabitants. Hangzhou, the former Song dynasty capital, might have had even more. These were the largest cities in the world, dense, crowded, perfect conditions for disease transmission, and Chinese cities had rats. Lots of rats, in the grain stores, in the markets, in the walls of houses, thriving on human waste and food scraps, living in close contact with humans, sharing living spaces. When plague-infected fleas reached these rat populations, the disease exploded. Chinese records from the 1330s and 1340s describe devastating epidemics, entire provinces affected, cities losing half their populations, the dead piling up faster than they could be buried. One chronicle from Hubei province reports that in 1334, an epidemic killed 5 million people. 5 million in one province, in 1 year. The number is almost certainly exaggerated. Record keeping during catastrophes is notoriously unreliable. But even if the real number was 1/10 of that, we're talking about apocalyptic death tolls. Another report from Hebei province describes 90% mortality in some districts. 9 out of 10 people dead. Villages standing empty. Crops rotting in fields because there was no one left to harvest them. The plague spread through China with terrifying speed, following rivers, roads, trade routes. Anywhere humans traveled, plague followed, and the Mongol Empire facilitated this spread. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had created stable, protected trade routes spanning from China to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was flourishing. Merchants could travel from Beijing to Baghdad to Venice with relative safety. Trade goods flowed, ideas flowed, and so did disease. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 25 and 125 million people in China between 1330 and 1353. The range is huge because Chinese record keeping during this period was disrupted by the plague itself. Record keepers died. Archives were lost. The very infrastructure that would document the catastrophe was destroyed by the catastrophe. But even the low estimate 25 million represents roughly half the Chinese population at the time. Half gone. In 2 decades, the Yuan dynasty never recovered. The plague, combined with natural disasters and internal rebellions, led to the dynasty's collapse in 1368. The Ming dynasty rose from the ashes. China rebuilt, but it was a different China, smaller, changed, scarred by the plague years. But while China was burning, plague was spreading west. along those same Silk Road routes that had brought prosperity. Caravans travelled from China through Central Asia, stopping at oasis towns, trading in Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, cities that connected east and west, cities with their own rat populations waiting to be infected. The disease spread through Persia, through the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that ruled modern-day Iran and Iraq. Persian chronicles describe the same patterns: mass death, social disruption, fear. A Persian historian named Hamdallah Mostofi wrote that the plague reduced Iran's population from 25 million to just 5 million. Those numbers are almost certainly wrong, exaggerated in the way that medieval chroniclers often exaggerated. But they convey the psychological impact, the sense that nearly everyone had died, that the world had ended. By the mid-1340s, plague had reached the eastern Mediterranean. The trade routes from Central Asia converged in the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, a crucial hub connecting the Silk Road to Mediterranean maritime trade. And here, at a place called Kaffa, plague would make the leap that would seal Europe's fate. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, a walled port city where Italian merchants bought silks and spices from Central Asian caravans and loaded them onto ships bound for Venice, Genoa, and other Mediterranean ports. The city was cosmopolitan, multicultural. Armenians, Turks, Greeks, Italians all mixing in the markets, trading, making deals, living in relative prosperity. In 1346, a Mongol army besieged Kaffa. This was part of the internal conflicts within the fragmenting Mongol Empire. The details of the political dispute don't matter much. What matters is that during the siege, plague arrived, the Mongol army started dying. Not from battle wounds, from disease. The plague had caught up with them, infected their camps, started killing soldiers faster than any Italian defenders could. The Mongol commander, sources call him Khan Janabeg, though details are uncertain, made a decision that would change history. If his army was dying of plague, maybe he could share the plague with his enemies. He ordered his soldiers to catapult the bodies of plague victims over the city walls. Into Kaffa. Biological warfare. Probably the first documented case in history. Did this actually transmit plague? Maybe. The corpses themselves probably weren't infectious. Yersinia pestis doesn't survive long in dead tissue. But the fleas on those corpses were very much alive and very much infectious. And if infected fleas got into the city, they'd find rats. And from rats to humans is just one bite away. Whether the catapulted corpses actually caused Kaffa's outbreak, or whether plague was already there, spreading through the usual flea, rat, human route, doesn't really matter. The effect was the same. Plague exploded in Kaffa. People started dying. The Italian merchants panicked. They'd been through sieges before. But plague, that was different. That was inescapable. They made a decision. Flee. Load the ships. Escape while they still could. In October 1346, a fleet of Genoese trading ships left Kaffa. Destination home, Genoa, Venice, Messina, the safe, familiar ports of Italy. But these ships carried more than silk and spices. They carried rats, and infected fleas, and possibly infected crew members, though showing no symptoms yet. Plague's incubation period is 1 to 7 days. You can be infected and not know it. Can be spreading disease before you feel sick. 12 ships. That's how many reportedly left Kaffa that October. 12 ships fleeing plague. 12 ships that would deliver plague to Europe's doorstep. Later, people would call them the ships of death. The ships that brought the apocalypse. the vessels that ended the medieval world. They set sail across the Black Sea, crossed into the Mediterranean, stopped at ports along the way to take on supplies, drop off cargo, pick up new trade goods, and at every stop they left plague behind. Let's stay with those ships for a moment. Picture what life was like aboard a medieval merchant vessel in 1346. These weren't large ships by modern standards. Genoese trading galleys were maybe 100 to 130 feet long, narrow, built for speed and cargo capacity, not comfort. The crew numbered perhaps 150 to 200 men, sailors, oarsmen, merchants, guards, all crammed together in tight quarters. Below deck, the cargo hold, bales of silk, sacks of spices, crates of precious goods, and in every dark corner, in every stack of cargo, rats, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, living off spilled grain, breeding in the warm, dark spaces, and their fleas. The voyage from Caffa to Italy would take weeks, maybe months, depending on weather and how many ports they stopped at along the way. Weeks of men living in close quarters, sleeping packed together below deck, sharing food, sharing air, sharing space with rats and fleas and bacteria. The first sailor probably got sick within days of leaving Caffa. Maybe he noticed the flea bite. Maybe he didn't. A tiny red mark itching. Nothing unusual. Fleas were everywhere on these ships. Nobody worried about flea bites. Then the fever, the chills, the headache, the swelling in his groin or armpit, growing, hardening, turning black. By the time the swelling was obvious, he was doomed. And so was everyone around him. One sick sailor coughs, breathes, shares drinking water from the same barrel, uses the same bucket, sleeps next to other crew members in the cramped below deck quarters. If his plague was pneumonic, if it had reached his lungs, every cough sent infected droplets into the air, into the lungs of men sleeping 3 feet away, close enough to share body heat in the cold Mediterranean nights. The ship became a plague incubator, a floating death trap, and it was heading directly for the ports of Europe. But before we follow those ships, let's go back. Back to Caffa, back to the siege, because what happened there is both horrifying and darkly fascinating. A moment where medieval warfare met medieval disease with catastrophic results. Caffa in 1346 was prosperous. The Genoese had controlled the city for decades. They'd built strong walls, a good harbour, warehouses filled with trade goods. The city's population was probably around 30,000 to 40,000 people, a mix of Genoese colonists, Armenian Christians, Greek Orthodox communities, and various other merchants and craftspeople. The Mongol Golden Horde nominally controlled the region, but the relationship between the Mongols and the Genoese was complicated, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile, shifting alliances based on trade interests and political convenience. In 1346, the relationship turned hostile. Khan Janibeg, leader of the Golden Horde, brought an army to Caffa. Sources vary on the size, maybe 10,000 men, maybe more. He surrounded the city, cut off land access, began a traditional siege. The Genoese were experienced at this. They had supplies, strong walls, access to the sea, which meant they could receive supplies by ship if needed. They settled in for a long siege, confident they could outlast the Mongol army. Then plague arrived in the Mongol camp. We don't know exactly when, probably early in the siege, late 1346, perhaps. But within weeks of the siege beginning, Mongol soldiers started dying. At first, maybe the commanders thought it was camp fever, dysentery, the kinds of diseases that always plagued armies living in close quarters with poor sanitation. Not unusual. not alarming. But this was different. This killed faster, killed more. The symptoms were strange, terrifying, swellings, black skin, delirium, death within days. The Mongol army started to panic. Soldiers deserted, fled back to their homes, carrying plague with them, infecting villages across the steppes. The army that had come to conquer Kaffa was dying faster than any battle could kill them. Khan Janibeg faced a choice: retreat and admit defeat, or find some way to make the disease work for him instead of against him. He chose the latter, a decision that would echo through history. The Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, writing a few years later, describes what happened next. His account is our primary source. It might be embellished. Medieval chroniclers loved dramatic details, but the core story appears in multiple sources. Janibeg ordered his men to collect the bodies of plague victims, load them onto catapults, and hurl them over the walls into Kaffa. Biological warfare, deliberate use of disease as a weapon. The corpses arsing through the air, landing in the streets, in courtyards, on rooftops, spreading terror even before spreading disease. D. Mussi describes the scene inside Kaffa, mountains of dead, piling up, the survivors unable to bury them fast enough, the stench overwhelming, the fear absolute. Did the catapulted corpses actually transmit plague? Modern scholars debate this. Dead bodies aren't typically infectious with Yersinia pestis. The bacteria doesn't survive long after the host dies. But the fleas on those bodies were very much alive and desperate. Their hosts had died. They needed new blood sources. Some would have stayed on the corpses during the flight through the air. Others would have jumped off looking for living hosts as soon as the body landed. Rats, humans, anything warm, and Kaffa had plenty of rats. Every medieval city did, living in the walls, in the granaries, in the sewers. The arriving fleas would find them easily, bite them, infect them, and from rats to humans was just one more bite. Whether Janibeg's biological warfare actually caused the outbreak in Kaffa, or whether plague was already spreading through the normal rat, flea, human route, perhaps brought in by merchants before the siege, doesn't change the outcome. Plague exploded inside the city walls. People started dying, dozens per day, then hundreds. The Genoese defenders, who'd been confidently manning the walls, started collapsing at their posts. The markets emptied. The streets grew silent. The city leadership panicked. This wasn't a siege they could outlast. This was death inside the walls, inescapable, unstoppable. The decision was made: evacuate. The ships in the harbour would be loaded. Anyone healthy enough to travel would flee. Leave the dead, leave the dying, leave the city, save whoever could be saved. And so in October 1346, the Genoese fleet prepared to depart. Merchants loaded what cargo they could. Families packed their most precious possessions. Crew members rushed to get the ships ready for a desperate voyage home. Nobody checked for illness. Nobody screened for symptoms. Nobody thought to quarantine. The concept didn't exist yet. They just wanted to leave, to escape the dying city, to reach home, safety. The ships departed. 12 of them, according to some sources, maybe more, maybe fewer. Details are unclear. Medieval record keeping during catastrophes was chaotic at best. But we know some ships left Kaffa that October. We know they carried desperate people fleeing plague. We know they were heading for Italy. And we know that within those ships, in the cargo holds, in the sleeping quarters, in the very fabric of the sails and ropes, plague travelled with them. The voyage took weeks. Mediterranean sailing in the 14th century was slow. The ships would stop at ports along the way. Constantinople, perhaps. Islands in the Aegean. Anywhere to take on freshwater food, make repairs. And at each stop, they left plague behind. Infected rats jumping ship to explore new ports. Infected fleas hitching rides on cargo being unloaded. Infected people going ashore, not yet showing symptoms, spreading bacteria with every breath. The ships were plague bombs, floating across the Mediterranean, ticking, about to explode across Europe. Some of the ships never made it to Italy. Crew members died en route. Without enough healthy sailors to man the vessels, some ships drifted, were wrecked in storms, ran aground on desolate shores, their cargoes lost, their crews dead or dying. But others kept sailing, kept making port, kept spreading death. The first confirmed arrival was in Messina, Sicily, October 1347, exactly 1 year after leaving Caffa. 12 ships, the exact number again, which makes some historians suspicious that this might be symbolic rather than literal, arrived in Messina's harbour. The port master and city officials went aboard to inspect. Standard procedure: check the cargo, assess tariffs, welcome the merchants. They found horror. Most of the crew was dead, bodies lying on the deck, in the holds. The survivors, if there were any, were delirious with fever, covered in buboes, coughing blood, and the rats. Witnesses describe rats swarming off the ships, hundreds of them, fleeing the dying vessels, scurrying into Messina's warehouses and homes and sewers, bringing their infected fleas with them. The city officials recognized plague. They'd heard rumors from the east, stories of cities dying, of ships arriving with dead crews. They panicked. Immediately ordered the ships expelled from the harbour, pushed back out to sea, forbidden to dock. But it was too late. The rats had already disembarked. The fleas had already jumped to new hosts. The bacteria was already spreading through Messina's rat population. Within days, people in Messina started dying. The same symptoms: fever, buboes, delirium, death. The plague had reached Europe. October 1347. The medieval world had about 6 years left before everything changed. But Messina was just the first. Those 12 ships didn't all go to Sicily. Some headed for Genoa, some for Venice, some for other Italian ports, and everywhere they docked, even briefly, they left plague behind. By the end of 1347, plague was burning through Italian port cities: Genoa, Pisa, Venice, every major trading hub on the Mediterranean coast. And from those ports, it spread inland, following trade routes, river valleys, roads, anywhere people travelled. The wave was coming, and nothing could stop it. Messina in October 1347, a prosperous Sicilian city, population maybe 50,000, stone buildings clustered around a natural harbour, markets bustling with Mediterranean trade, fishing boats, merchant vessels, the normal rhythms of medieval urban life. Then the ships arrive, the death ships from Caffa. Within days, the symptoms appear. A merchant develops a fever. A dock worker finds a swelling in his armpit. A sailor's wife starts coughing blood. At first, people think it's normal illness, the kind of sickness that passes through cities regularly, concerning but not catastrophic. Then more people get sick, and more, and the sick start dying. Not slowly, not after long illness. Fast, within days, sometimes within hours. The realization spreads faster than the disease. This is plague, the thing they'd heard rumors about. The sickness killing people in the east. It's here now, in Messina, in their city, in their homes. Panic sets in. the wealthy flee, pack what they can carry and head for the countryside, for their rural estates, for anywhere away from the dying city. They think distance will save them, rural air will protect them. They're wrong. Many are already infected, carrying plague to the villages, to the manor houses, to the monasteries and farms they flee to, spreading it faster than if they'd stayed in place. The poor can't flee. They have nowhere to go, no country estates, no wealthy relatives in distant cities. They stay. They watch their neighbours die, their families, themselves. The city government tries to respond, closes the port, forbids ships from docking. Too late, the rats are already there. The fleas are already spreading. They order the sick confined to their homes. Doors marked, no one in or out. But who enforces this? The city guards are dying too. The officials who give orders are dying. The entire infrastructure of urban governance is collapsing under the weight of death. Churches fill with desperate people praying for deliverance, for healing, for understanding. Why is this happening? What have we done to deserve this? The priests have no answers, just prayers. And one by one, the priests start dying too, killed by the very people they're trying to comfort, infected through proximity, through the sacraments, through mercy. By November 1347, Messina is dying, not metaphorically, literally. The city is bleeding people, thousands dead, thousands more fleeing, the markets empty, the harbours silent, the streets increasingly deserted except for the dying and the dead. Contemporary accounts describe bodies lying in the streets, no one to collect them, no one willing to touch them, families abandoning their own dead, mothers leaving children's corpses in houses and fleeing, children watching parents die and running away in terror. The social fabric tears, the bonds of community and obligation that held medieval society together snap under the pressure of pure survival instinct. Every person for themselves, every family isolated, trust collapses, and Messina is just the first. The plague spreads to other Sicilian cities, Catania, Syracuse, Palermo, following roads, rivers, coastlines. By the end of 1347, all of Sicily is infected, but Sicily is an island. The plague should have been containable, should have burned through the local population and then faded. Isolated, contained. It doesn't. Because ships keep sailing, trade continues, people flee, and all of them carry plague. Ships from Messina sail to mainland Italy before the port is closed. They dock in Naples, in Genoa, in Pisa, in Venice, and at each port the same pattern repeats. Arrival, infection, outbreak, panic, death. Genoa gets hit particularly hard. This is where many of the Kaffir ships were heading, the home port for the merchants who'd fled the siege. They arrive expecting welcome, expecting safety. Instead, they bring doom. Genoese authorities recognize the danger faster than Messina did. They have the advantage of warning. Ships arriving from Sicily and the east carry news of plague. Descriptions of symptoms, tales of cities dying. Genoa tries to protect itself. They turn away ships from infected ports, establish health inspections, create isolation areas for suspected cases. They're inventing quarantine protocols in real time, trying to stop something they don't understand. It doesn't work. The plague is already in the city, brought by earlier ships, spreading through the rat population. The precautions are too late and too incomplete. By January 1348, Genoa is burning with plague. The city that had been one of the wealthiest, most powerful maritime republics in the Mediterranean is brought to its knees by bacteria. Venice tries even harder to protect itself. The Venetian Republic has resources, organization, a government that can enforce rules. They establish strict port controls, mandatory inspection of all ships, isolation of suspected plague cases on outlying islands. They invent the concept of quarantine. Ships arriving from infected ports must anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, which gives us the word quarantine. If no one gets sick during those 40 days, the ship can dock. If anyone shows symptoms, the entire ship is refused entry. It's a brilliant idea, and with modern understanding of disease transmission, it might have worked. But they don't know about the incubation period, don't know that people can be infected and contagious before showing symptoms, don't know about the rats in the cargo holds, the fleas in the fabric. Plague enters Venice anyway. Despite all the precautions, despite the quarantines, despite the desperate attempts at control. By the spring of 1348, Venice is dying like every other Italian city. Pisa, Florence, Milan, Rome, city after city falls. The plague spreads inland, following trade routes, river valleys, the roads that connect the Italian states into a network of commerce become highways for death. And it's not just rats and fleas now. The pneumonic form is spreading, person to person. No vector required, just proximity, just breathing the same air. This form spreads faster, kills faster. Is even more terrifying because you can see it. You can watch someone cough and know they're spreading death. Italian physicians try to treat it. They apply all their knowledge, all their training, bloodletting to balance the humours, lancing the buboes to drain the corruption, herbal remedies, prayer, amulets, magic. Nothing works. Patients die anyway, and the physicians die with them, killed by the disease they're trying to cure. By March 1348, being a physician in Italy is nearly a death sentence. Many flee, abandon their profession, choose survival over duty. Those who stay become heroes, martyrs. They know they're probably going to die. Know that treating plague patients is almost certainly fatal. They do it anyway. Some from duty, some from faith, some from simple human compassion. They can't save their patients, but they can ease suffering, can offer comfort, can ensure people don't die alone. And one by one, they die, joining the thousands they tried to save. The death toll in Italy is staggering. By the summer of 1348, Italian cities have lost 40 to 60% of their populations, some areas even more. Florence goes from roughly 120,000 people to fewer than 50,000. Venice from 110,000 to maybe 60,000. Genoa is gutted. Entire families are wiped out. Noble lineages that had existed for centuries end. No heirs, no survivors. Their palaces stand empty. Their businesses collapse. Their wealth scattered or lost. But Italy is just the beginning. While Italian cities are dying, the plague is spreading north, west, east, across the Alps into France and Germany, across the Mediterranean to North Africa and Spain, following every trade route, every connection, every human movement. By the spring of 1348, plague has reached France. Marseille falls first, another port city, another entry point from Mediterranean trade. The pattern repeats. Arrival, infection, outbreak, panic, death. From Marseille, plague spreads up the Rhône Valley, following the river, following trade. Lyon, Avignon, seat of the papacy at the time. The disease doesn't respect religious authority any more than it respected secular power. Pope Clement VI watches plague devastate Avignon, kills his cardinals, his priests, his servants. He survives locked in isolation in his chambers, with fires constantly burning to purify the air. The fires don't purify anything, but the isolation helps. Fewer contacts means fewer opportunities for infection. Clement does something remarkable, though. He issues a papal bull protecting Jews from persecution, because as plague spreads, so does scapegoating. People desperate for explanation, for someone to blame, Jews become targets, accused of poisoning wells, of causing the plague through malice or witchcraft. Clement's bull declares this nonsense, points out that Jews are dying from plague just like Christians, that the accusations are baseless, that persecution must stop. It doesn't stop. The bull is ignored. Across Europe, Jewish communities are attacked, massacred, entire populations killed by Christian mobs looking for someone to blame. The plague kills, and humans kill each other in the plague's shadow. By the summer of 1348, plague has reached Paris, the largest city in Europe. Population over 200,000, dense, crowded, perfect conditions for epidemic spread. Paris burns with plague. The chronicler Jean de Venette describes mass graves outside the city, trenches dug wide enough for hundreds of bodies, filled daily, the living avoiding them, the stench overwhelming. Half of Paris dies, maybe more. The exact numbers are impossible to determine. Record keeping collapses during catastrophes. But the accounts agree, most people died. The city was never the same. Meanwhile, plague spreads west to Spain, south to North Africa, east into Central Europe. Every direction, every connection, every road and river and coastline becomes a route for death. By the fall of 1348, plague is everywhere in Mediterranean Europe. The wave has swept through, killed millions, tens of millions, and it's still spreading, north to England, to Scandinavia, to Ireland, to the furthest reaches of the European world. The wave was unstoppable, and it was only just beginning. June 1348, a ship arrives in the port of Melcombe Regis on England's southern coast. Modern-day Weymouth, a small port, not a major trading hub, just a regular merchant vessel bringing wine and cloth from France. The crew seems healthy. The cargo is normal. The portmaster sees nothing unusual. The ship is allowed to dock, to unload, to conduct business. Within days, people in Melcombe Regis start dying. The plague has reached England. England had warning. Months of warning. News from the continent had been arriving since the previous fall. Letters from merchants in Italy, reports from travellers, stories of entire cities dying. The English knew plague was coming. They just didn't know how to stop it. King Edward I Thorai was in France at the time, prosecuting the 100 Years' War. His armies had won a great victory at Crécy in 1346. He was besieging Calais, planning further campaigns, building an empire. The plague forced him home. You can't maintain military campaigns when your population is dying, when your soldiers are fleeing, when the entire logistics of warfare collapse under epidemic pressure. Edward returned to an England beginning to die. The plague spreads from Melcombe Regis along the coast to Bristol, to Southampton, to London, following trade routes, river valleys, roads, the same patterns as in Italy and France. London in 1348 had maybe 60,000 to 70,000 people, the largest city in England. Crowded, filthy by modern standards, open sewers, garbage in the streets, rats everywhere, prime conditions for plague. The disease arrives in the fall of 1348. By winter, London is dying. The chronicler Robert of Aversbury describes bodies piled in the streets, carts coming through daily to collect the dead. mass graves outside the city walls filling with thousands of corpses. The city tries to function. Markets try to stay open. Churches try to comfort the dying. Government tries to maintain order. But it's all collapsing. Too many key people dying. Too much fear. Too much chaos. Abbeys and monasteries get hit particularly hard. Communities of monks and nuns living in close quarters, sharing dormitories, eating together, praying together, perfect conditions for person-to-person transmission. Westminster Abbey loses most of its monks. The abbot dies. Many of the senior clergy die. The Abbey's records from this period are chaotic, fragmentary. The very people who kept records were dying. This pattern repeats across England. Monasteries that had stood for centuries, that had accumulated vast libraries and knowledge, gutted by plague, the knowledge preserved, but the people who understood it dead. By the spring of 1349, plague has spread through most of England. Rural areas aren't spared. Villages die. Entire communities sometimes. The survivors abandon their homes, flee to other villages or to cities, seeking safety in numbers. But numbers mean death. Concentration means transmission. The fleeing villagers bring plague to wherever they flee. The wave keeps spreading. North to Scotland. The Scots had been raiding English borderlands, taking advantage of England's distraction and weakness. They gather an army, plan a major invasion, to strike while England is vulnerable. Then plague arrives in Scotland, brought by English refugees, by traders, by the same connections that brought it everywhere else. The Scottish army dissolves, soldiers fleeing, not from English resistance, from disease. They call it the English pestilence, as if naming it after their enemy will protect them. It doesn't. Scotland dies like England, like France, like Italy. The plague doesn't care about nationality, about politics, about who you are or what you believe. It just kills, west to Ireland. Plague arrives in the summer of 1348, through ports trading with England and France, Dublin, Drogheda, Waterford. The port cities fall first, then inland. Following the same patterns, Ireland's population crashes, especially in the Anglo-Irish areas, the towns and settled regions. The Gaelic regions, more rural, more isolated, suffer less, but they suffer. Plague reaches even remote areas eventually. By 1349, plague has swept through the British Isles, killed maybe 40 to 60% of the population. Millions dead. England's population before the plague was around 5 to 6 million. After, maybe 2 to 3 million. Half. Gone in 2 years. Meanwhile, back on the continent, the wave keeps moving, north and east into Germany. German cities try to protect themselves. They've had warning. Reports from Italy and France. Descriptions of what's coming. They close their gates, restrict entry, establish health checks, try to quarantine. It doesn't work. The plague finds a way, through traders who show no symptoms yet, through rats in cargo shipments, through the 1,000 tiny connections that link medieval cities into trade networks. Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Hamburg. City after city falls. The same pattern, the same death toll, the same collapse of social order, and the same scapegoating. German cities see some of the worst anti-Jewish violence of the plague years. Entire Jewish communities massacred, thousands murdered, their property seized, their synagogues burned, all based on the baseless accusation that they caused the plague. Some authorities try to stop the violence, point out that Jews are dying from plague just like Christians, that the accusations make no sense. But mobs don't care about logic, they care about fear. about having someone to blame, about violence as an outlet for terror. By 1349, plague has reached Scandinavia. Ships from Germany bring it to Denmark, to Sweden, to Norway. The Norselands die. Bergen, Copenhagen, Stockholm, the trading cities that connected Scandinavia to the European trade network, become entry points for death. Even Iceland doesn't escape. Ships arrive in 1402, decades after the first wave, bringing plague to one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth. 2/3 of Iceland's population dies. A tiny population, a few thousand people. But to Iceland, it's apocalyptic. The island barely recovers. East to Poland, to Hungary, to Russia. The plague keeps spreading, keeps killing. By 1351, it's reached Moscow, the furthest extent of the wave. Finally running out of connected populations. Finally beginning to fade. But the damage is done. Europe has lost 30 to 60% of its population. Maybe 75 million people dead from a pre-plague population of around 125 million. Half gone in less than 5 years. Some regions suffer more than others. Mediterranean areas tend to lose 60 to 70%. Northern areas maybe 30 to 40%. Cities lose more than rural areas. Dense populations suffer more than dispersed ones. But everywhere suffers. Nowhere is truly spared. The speed of the spread is what makes it so catastrophic. This isn't a slow burn over decades. This is 5 years, from October 1347 in Messina to 1353, when the first wave finally exhausts itself. 5 years of continuous catastrophic death across an entire continent. Modern pandemics spread faster. Air travel, global connections. COVID-19 went worldwide in weeks. But the lethality was far lower. The mortality rate measured in single-digit percentages. Tragic, disruptive, but not civilizationally threatening. The Black Death was different. Mortality rates of 30 to 60%, sometimes higher. Some villages lost everyone. Literally, 100% mortality. The last person to die was found weeks or months later when travelers passed through and found silent villages. Bodies everywhere. No survivors. These dead villages became ghost towns, abandoned. The buildings slowly collapsing, the fields returning to forest. Centuries later, archaeologists find them deserted medieval villages, foundations of houses, outlines of streets, silent testimony to communities that plague erased from existence. By 1353, the first wave is over. The plague hasn't disappeared. It's still circulating, still killing, but the massive pandemic wave has passed. The explosive transmission has slowed. The disease has reached some kind of equilibrium with the surviving population. Europe in 1353 is a different world than Europe in 1347. Demographically, economically, socially, psychologically, everything has changed. Half the people are dead. Half. Imagine that. Walk down a street and half the buildings are empty. Go to church and half the pews are empty. Look around your workplace and half the positions are unfilled. Not because people quit. Because they're dead. The survivors are traumatized. They've watched friends die, family die, neighbors die. They've seen things humans shouldn't see. Mass graves. Bodies in the streets. Social collapse. The thin veneer of civilization stripped away by plague, revealing the fear and violence and chaos underneath, and they know it could come back. Any time. Without warning. Plague doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, starts killing. You could wake up tomorrow with a fever, a swelling, be dead by the end of the week. That knowledge, that constant threat changes people, changes societies. The medieval world ended with the plague. What came after was something new, built on the ashes. shaped by the trauma, carrying the scars. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what life was like during the plague. Not the statistics, not the demographics, the actual day-to-day experience of living in a plague city, of watching your world die around you, of making impossible choices, of surviving when most didn't. That's where the real horror lives. Not in the numbers, in the details, in the human stories, in the lives interrupted, destroyed, ended. The wave had swept through, but the individual experiences, the moments of terror and loss and desperate survival, those are what truly show us what the plague meant, what it cost, what it took from humanity. Picture yourself living in Florence. The year is 1348, spring. Normally, this would be a beautiful time. The weather warming, markets full of fresh produce, the city coming alive after winter. Instead, Florence is dying. You wake up in your home, a modest stone house, 2 rooms, shared with your spouse, your 3 children, your elderly mother. 7 people in tight quarters. Normal for medieval Florence. Comfortable, even by the standards of the time. You check each family member as they wake, looking for signs. Fever, lethargy, swelling. The symptoms you've learned to fear. Everyone seems healthy. Today, at least, you thank God. Say a prayer of protection. Hope it's enough. But you know it's probably not, because yesterday your neighbor died. The family 3 houses down lost everyone except a single child. The baker you've bought bread from for 20 years is gone. The priest who baptized your children is sick, coughing blood. Death is everywhere. You can't escape it, can't avoid it. You can only hope, pray, try to stay alive one more day. You need food. The markets are still open, barely. Fewer vendors than before. Many stalls empty. The merchants who remain are nervous, jumpy. They don't want customers getting too close. Don't want to touch money. Don't want contact. You approach a vegetable seller. She has onions, some wilted greens. Not much. Her prices are double what they were a month ago, triple. She knows people are desperate, knows they'll pay anything. Supply and demand, medieval capitalism in its rawest form. You negotiate. Try to bargain. She's not interested. Take it or leave it. You take it. You need to eat. Your children need to eat. Pride and fairness don't matter when you're starving. She won't touch your money directly. She has you drop coins into a bowl of vinegar. The theory is that vinegar purifies, kills the plague somehow. It doesn't, but she believes it. And belief is all anyone has right now. You take your vegetables and head home. Avoiding people. Staying to the edges of the street, not touching anything you don't have to. You've learned to be careful, to minimize contact. It might not help, but it can't hurt. On the way, you pass a house with the door marked. A red cross painted on the wood. A sign posted, God have mercy. This is a plague house. Someone inside is sick, or was sick, or died. The house is sealed. No one in or out. The sick trapped inside, left to die or recover on their own. You hurry past. Don't look too closely. Don't think about who might be inside, suffering, dying alone. Because if you think about it too much, you'll realize that could be your house tomorrow. Your door marked. Your family sealed inside. You see a cart coming down the street. The death cart. A wooden wagon pulled by a single exhausted horse. Driven by a man wrapped in cloth. Face covered. Gloves on his hands. He's a body collector. One of the desperate souls willing to handle corpses for pay. The cart is already half full. Bodies piled on top of each other. No dignity. No ritual, just disposal. Like garbage. Like plague victims are things instead of people. Instead of someone's mother. Someone's child. Someone's beloved. The collector calls out, "Bring out your dead. Bring out your dead." His voice is muffled, mechanical. He's said this hundreds of times. Thousands. He's stopped seeing the bodies as people. Stopped feeling. He has to survive this work. To stay sane. A door opens. A woman emerges, crying. She's dragging something. A body. Small. A child's body. She can barely lift it. Her strength is gone, drained by grief. By days of nursing a sick child who died anyway. The collector helps her, lifts the small body onto the cart. Doesn't say anything. What is there to say? The woman sobs, reaches toward the cart, toward her child, then stops, turns, goes back inside, closes the door. You hear the bolt slide, locking herself in, locking the world out. You watch the cart continue down the street. Watch it stop at another house. Another body added. Another family destroyed. You wonder how many bodies the cart will collect today. Dozens. Hundreds. How many carts are working the city? How many trips to the mass graves outside the walls? You arrive home. Lock the door. The world outside is dying. Inside, for now, your family is alive. You cook the vegetables, share them. The portions are small, food is scarce, but it's something. You eat together, quietly. Nobody talks about the plague. What's there to say? Everyone knows. Everyone is afraid. After the meal, your children want to go outside, to play, to see their friends. You say no. Too dangerous. Stay inside. Stay safe. They don't understand. They're young. They think you're being cruel, depriving them of joy for no reason. You don't explain. How do you explain plague to children? How do you tell them their friends might be dead? That the world isn't safe anymore? That you're keeping them inside because you're terrified that if they leave, they won't come back? So you just say no and ignore their protests and feel guilty but firm, because keeping them alive matters more than keeping them happy. Night falls. Florence grows dark. Normally, there would be lights in windows, sounds of life, laughter, music, conversation. Now, there's mostly silence, darkness. The city is becoming a tomb, a place where the living hide and the dead accumulate. You lie down to sleep, but you can't. You listen to your family breathing, your spouse beside you, your children in the next room, your mother's raspy breath from the corner. You count each breath. Make sure everyone is still breathing, still alive. You wonder if tomorrow someone will wake with fever, with the swelling, with the symptoms that mean death. You wonder if it will be you, if you'll be the one who brings plague into this house, if your family will have to watch you die, or if you'll watch them die. Both possibilities are unbearable, but you don't have a choice. You can't control this, can't prevent it, can only endure, day by day, hour by hour, breath by breath. This is life during plague, not the dramatic death scenes, not the mass graves and carts and statistics. This, the quiet terror, the constant vigilance, the grinding, exhausting fear that never stops, that follows you through every moment of every day. Multiply this experience by millions. Everyone in Florence feeling this. Everyone in Italy. Everyone in Europe. Millions of people living in constant fear. Watching neighbors die. Avoiding contact. Sleeping fitfully. Waking grateful to be alive and terrified it won't last. The plague doesn't just kill. It tortures. It makes every day a trial. Every interaction fraught. Every goodbye potentially final. It strips away the comfortable assumptions that life is safe, that tomorrow will come, that your loved ones will still be there. You learn things about yourself during plague, things you wish you didn't know, like how easily you can walk past a corpse in the street and barely flinch. How quickly you can abandon compassion when survival is at stake. How thin the veneer of civilization really is. You learn who your real friends are, the ones who still check on you, who share food when they have it, who help carry bodies when someone dies, and you learn who disappears, who flees, who hoards, who saves themselves at others' expense. Families fracture. The plague reveals true character. Some people become heroes, caring for the sick even when it means certain death, sharing their last resources, maintaining humanity in the face of horror. Others become monsters, abandoning sick family members, stealing from the dead, using the chaos to settle old scores, to take what they want, to indulge cruelty that peacetime morality would have constrained. And most people are somewhere in between, trying to be good, trying to be brave, but also trying to survive, making compromises, drawing lines, helping when they can but protecting themselves when they must. The plague exposes everyone, shows who we really are when the structures that usually govern behavior collapse. When there's no law enforcement because the guards are dead, no social pressure because everyone is isolated, no divine judgment because God seems to have abandoned the world. You see clergy fleeing their parishes, physicians refusing to treat patients, magistrates hiding in country estates, the people who are supposed to lead, supposed to help, saving themselves instead. And you see the opposite. Franciscan monks volunteering to care for plague victims, knowing they'll probably die. Doing it anyway, because their faith demands it. Physicians staying at their posts despite the danger. Treating patient after patient. Watching them die. Knowing they'll likely follow. Doing it anyway, because that's what physicians do. Ordinary people becoming extraordinary, not because they want to, because circumstances demand it, because someone has to collect the bodies, someone has to care for orphans, someone has to maintain some shred of human decency in a world that's falling apart. The days blur together. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. Time loses meaning when every day is the same. Fear, survival, checking family members for symptoms, avoiding contact, praying, hoping, enduring. You start to feel numb. The horror becomes normal. Death becomes routine. You stop crying when neighbors die. Stop being shocked when you see bodies. Stop feeling much of anything except a dull, constant dread. This is what trauma does. Protects you by shutting down emotion, by making the unbearable bearable through numbness. It's a survival mechanism, but it costs something. Costs your humanity, your ability to feel, your connection to others. Some people break. The stress is too much. They go mad, run through the streets screaming, claim to see demons, attack people for imagined offenses. The plague doesn't just kill bodies. It kills minds. Others embrace hedonism. If death is coming anyway, why not enjoy what time remains? They drink, feast, have sex with strangers, abandon all restraint. Carpe diem taken to its extreme. Live for today because tomorrow you'll probably be dead. Still others withdraw completely, seal themselves in their homes, refuse all contact, let the world outside go to hell. They'll wait it out, survive through isolation, hope that when they finally emerge, there's still a world worth emerging into. You try to maintain normalcy, keep routines, Cook meals at regular times. Make your children wash. Say prayers at bedtime. Pretend that life is normal, that the world isn't ending, that tomorrow will be okay. The pretense is exhausting. But it's all you have. The alternative is to admit how bad things are, to accept that you might all die, that nothing you do matters, that prayer is useless and precautions are futile and fate is already written. You can't accept that, won't accept it. So you cook, you clean, you maintain the fiction of normal life, while outside the city dies. This is life during plague, not one dramatic crisis, not one terrible day, but months of this, months of fear and death and numbness and desperate hope, months of waking up grateful to be alive, months of going to sleep wondering if you'll wake up, months that feel like years, that age you, that break something inside you that will never fully heal, that leaves scars invisible but permanent. The survivors will carry these months for the rest of their lives, will remember, will tell their children and grandchildren, will wake from nightmares decades later, still seeing the bodies, still hearing the carts, still feeling the fear. The plague doesn't end when you survive it. It stays with you, changes you, marks you as someone who lived through hell and somehow came out the other side. But first, you have to survive. And survival means enduring, day after day, hour after hour, breath after breath. The living envied the dead. Florence, before the plague, was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Banking capital of the continent, home to the Medici family's growing empire, centre of art and commerce and learning, population around 120,000, prosperous, organised, functioning. Florence in the summer of 1348 was dying, and with it, all the systems that made the city work. Start with the economy. Florence's economy was built on banking and textile production, wool trade, silk, luxury goods. These required complex supply chains, raw materials from England, dyes from the East, skilled workers at every step, transportation networks, credit systems, all of it interconnected, all of it dependent on people. When the plague hit, the people started dying. Workers in the textile workshops, merchants who managed trade, bankers who provided credit. The entire system was built on relationships and knowledge and expertise. And those died with the people. The wool trade collapsed. Why? Because English shepherds were dying. The merchants who shipped wool to Florence were dying. The workers who processed wool in Florentine workshops were dying. The buyers who purchased finished cloth were dying. Every link in the chain broke simultaneously. The Paracas Bank, one of the largest in Europe, collapsed in 1343 before the plague even arrived, partly due to bad loans to English kings. The Byrd Bank followed. The plague finished what poor financial decisions started. The remaining banks struggled. Credit dried up. Without credit, trade stops. Without trade, cities starve. Agriculture failed even more catastrophically. Medieval agriculture was labor-intensive. You needed people to plough fields, to plant, to weed, to harvest, to process grain, to transport it to cities. Every step required human hands. The plague killed farm workers, not all of them, but enough. And the survivors had options they'd never had before. Farm work is brutal, backbreaking, poorly paid. If you're a peasant and half the population just died, suddenly you have choices. You can demand higher wages, better conditions, or you can leave. Go to a city where labor is desperate and wages are higher. Many chose to leave. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries were abandoned. Crops rotted unharvested. Grain stores ran empty. Within a year of the plague's arrival, food shortages were widespread. Not because there wasn't enough land, because there weren't enough people to work it. The survivors faced a paradox. Fewer people should mean more resources per person, more food to go around, more wealth to share. But it didn't work that way, because the systems that distributed resources collapsed. Food rotted in fields while cities starved. Warehouses full of grain sat locked while people went hungry. Not because of scarcity, because of breakdown. Trade routes failed. Who wants to travel during a plague? Who wants to enter infected cities? Merchants stopped moving. Ships stayed in port. Caravans disbanded. The network that connected medieval Europe went dark. This had cascading effects. Cities depended on imported food, grain from the countryside, fish from coastal regions, wine from France, spices from the east. When trade stopped, cities starved. When cities stopped buying, rural economies collapsed. Everyone suffered. Government functions broke down. Medieval government was personal. The lord of a city knew the leading families. Magistrates knew the merchants. Justice was administered by specific judges who understood local customs. Records were kept by specific clerks who knew the systems. When these people died, and they did, in huge numbers, government stopped working. Who enforces laws when the sheriff is dead? Who collects taxes when the tax collectors are dead? Who judges disputes when the judges are dead? Some cities tried to maintain continuity. Promoted junior officials, recruited new personnel, invented new systems on the fly. Some succeeded, maintained basic order, kept food distribution working, buried the dead. Others failed. Completely, government dissolved, authority vanished. What remained was chaos, looting, violence, vigilante justice, the strong preying on the weak. Medieval social order stripped away, revealing Hobbes's state of nature underneath. Nasty, brutish, short. Florence, to its credit, tried. The city government continued functioning, passed emergency measures, organized body disposal, attempted price controls on food to prevent gouging, recruited new officials to replace the dead. But they were overwhelmed. The scale of death was too large, the problems too complex, the resources too depleted. They did what they could. It wasn't enough. Nobody could do enough. This was beyond human capacity to manage. The church struggled too. Medieval Christianity was central to daily life. You went to Mass, confessed sins, received sacraments. The church provided structure, meaning, comfort, community. The plague devastated the clergy. Priests died in huge numbers. Why? Because their job required contact with the sick and dying, administering last rites, hearing deathbed confessions, comforting the afflicted. Every one of these sacred duties meant exposure, infection, death. Many priests fled, abandoned their parishes, saved themselves. Can you blame them? They were human, afraid. They watched their colleagues die, knew they'd die too if they stayed. Some fled, many fled. Those who stayed became heroes, martyrs. They knew the cost, administered sacraments anyway, comforted the dying anyway, buried the dead anyway, and died, one after another, filling the roles of fallen colleagues until they fell too. The church's authority suffered. People prayed. The prayers went unanswered. People attended Mass. They died anyway. People made offerings, bought indulgences, confessed sins, did everything the church said would protect them, and died. Faith can survive many things, but when God seems absent during catastrophe, faith wavers. Why is this happening? Why won't God intervene? Why do the faithful die while the wicked sometimes survive? The clergy had no good answers. Divine punishment for sin. Then why do babies die? Why do priests die? Why do the devout die while blasphemers sometimes live? The theology didn't match the reality. Some people lost faith entirely. If God allows this, maybe God doesn't exist, or doesn't care, or isn't worth worshipping. Atheism was dangerous in medieval Europe, heresy punishable by death. But when half the population is already dead, what's one more risk? Others turn to alternative spirituality. Mysticism, superstition, folk magic. If the church can't save you, maybe pagan charms will. Maybe witchcraft. Maybe deals with demons. Desperate people try desperate things. The church responded with blame. This is punishment for sin. Moral decay. Corruption. Licentiousness. If you die, it's because you deserved it. This message rang hollow. Too many obviously innocent dead. Too much suffering to attribute to divine justice. But the message had consequences. If plague is punishment for sin, then the sinful must be identified and punished. Scapegoats must be found. And medieval Europe had ready-made scapegoats. Jews, heretics, foreigners, the marginalized and vulnerable. Jewish communities were targeted first and worst. Accused of poisoning wells, of causing plague through malice or witchcraft. The accusations were absurd. Jews were dying from plague too. But logic doesn't matter when people are terrified and looking for someone to blame. Pogroms swept through Europe. Entire Jewish communities massacred. Thousands killed. Tens of thousands. Their property seized. Their synagogues burned. Their books destroyed. Centuries of Jewish scholarship and culture erased in bursts of mob violence. Some authorities tried to stop it. Pope Clement VI issued bulls protecting Jews, pointed out the accusations were false. Some kings and bishops tried to protect Jewish communities. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't. The mobs were too angry, too desperate for someone to blame. Strasbourg in 1349 saw one of the worst massacres. The city's Jewish population, about 2,000 people, was rounded up, forced into a wooden building. The building was set on fire. They burned alive. All of them, men, women, children, killed for a plague they didn't cause, killed because people needed someone to hate. This happened in city after city. Basel, Freiburg, Cologne, Erfurt, Mainz. The pattern repeated. Accusations, arrests, massacres, theft. By the time the plague ended, Jewish populations in many regions were decimated. Not by plague, by murder. Other scapegoats suffered too. Lepers accused of poisoning. Beggars accused of spreading disease. Foreigners accused of bringing plague. Anyone different. Anyone vulnerable. Anyone who could be blamed. The social contract shredded. The bonds that held communities together, mutual obligation, trust, shared values, collapsed under the pressure of plague and fear. People turned on neighbors. Families fractured. Communities dissolved into individuals trying to survive. Property rights became meaningless. If you died with no heirs, your property should go to the state or the church. In practice, it went to whoever took it first. Looting was rampant. Houses of the dead stripped of anything valuable. Bodies sometimes robbed before they were cold. The wealthy tried to protect their property through lawyers and documents, drew up wills, made provisions. It rarely worked. Lawyers died. Documents were ignored. When half the population is dead, who enforces contracts? Who upholds property law? Entire noble families were wiped out. Lineages that had held lands for centuries ended. No heirs. No survivors. Their estates reverted to chaos, competing claims, armed conflicts. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed social structures. Labour shortages transformed the economy. Before the plague, labour was cheap, peasants were abundant. Landlords could exploit them. Low wages, poor conditions. If a worker complained, replace them. There were always more workers. After the plague, workers had power. For the first time in centuries, half the workforce was dead. The survivors could demand better wages, better conditions, better treatment, or they could leave, go elsewhere, find better opportunities. Landlords panicked. They tried to maintain the old order, passed laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding workers from leaving their lands, trying to legally enforce the previous system. It didn't work. Workers ignored the laws, moved anyway, demanded higher wages anyway. What were landlords going to do? Imprison everyone. Kill the remaining workers. They needed the labour. They had to compromise. This economic transformation would have profound long-term effects. The plague weakened feudalism, strengthened workers, created the conditions that would eventually lead to the end of serfdom, the birth of a market-based labour economy, the early stirrings of capitalism. But in the immediate term, it was chaos, the old order collapsing, the new order not yet formed, just breakdown, disorder, everyone scrambling to survive in a world where all the rules had changed and nobody knew what came next. By 1350, when the first wave of plague finally exhausted itself, European society was fundamentally broken. Not just damaged, broken. The systems that made medieval civilization function had collapsed. The people who maintained those systems were dead. The trust and cooperation that allowed communities to exist had dissolved. What remained was traumatized survivors trying to rebuild, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to create some kind of life in the ruins of the old world. But first, during the plague, people tried to fight it, tried to cure it, tried to understand it with the limited medical knowledge of the 14th century, with medieval theories of disease, with desperation and faith and wishful thinking. They failed, almost completely, but the attempt reveals something about human nature. Our refusal to give up, our determination to fight, even when fighting is futile, our stubborn hope that knowledge, even limited, even wrong, can somehow save us. The year is 1348. You're a physician in Paris. You've studied at the university for years, learned the works of Galen and Hippocrates, mastered the theory of the four humours. You understand, or think you understand, how the human body works, how disease occurs, how to treat it. Then plague arrives, and everything you know is useless. Medieval medicine was based on humoral theory, the idea that the body contains four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and health depends on maintaining balance among them. Disease occurs when the humours become imbalanced. Treatment meant restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, diet, and herbs. This theory had worked, sort of, for centuries. For normal illnesses, fevers, digestive problems, minor infections. The treatments might not have actually cured anything. Many historians think patients got better despite treatment, not because of it, but they didn't usually make things worse. And they gave physicians and patients something to do. A framework for understanding illness. Plague broke the framework completely. Physicians tried applying humoral theory. Plague causes fever. That suggests excess of blood. Solution: bloodletting. Drain some blood to restore balance. They open veins. drained pints of blood from fever-ravaged patients, made them weaker, more likely to die. The treatment killed as surely as the disease. Plague causes buboes, swellings full of corruption. Solution lance them, cut them open, drain the poisonous fluid. This actually made some medical sense. The buboes were infected. Draining them might help. In practice, it rarely did. The infection was systemic. Draining surface buboes didn't address the bacteria multiplying throughout the body, and the lancing was dangerous. Using non-sterile blades, opening wounds in patients whose immune systems were already overwhelmed. Often the wounds became infected themselves. Secondary infections killing patients who might have survived the primary plague. But physicians tried. They had to try. Doing nothing meant admitting helplessness. Admitting their entire medical training was useless. Better to try something. Anything. Even if it didn't work. Some physicians theorized plague was caused by corrupted air, miasma, full vapors rising from swamps, rotting matter, or the conjunction of planets creating atmospheric disturbances. This wasn't entirely wrong. Disease does correlate with poor sanitation. But the mechanism was backwards. It's not the smell that kills. It's the bacteria in the filth that produces the smell. If corrupted air caused plague, the solution was to purify the air. Burn aromatic substances, juniper, rosemary, mora. Fill rooms with pleasant smoke. Carry herb bundles. Breathe through cloth soaked in vinegar or rose water. The famous plague doctor costume developed from this theory. The beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs and spices to filter corrupted air. The long waxed coat to prevent miasma from touching skin. The gloves and hat and stick for maintaining distance from patients. It's an iconic image. The bird-beaked plague doctor. Strange, unsettling, vaguely ominous, like a crow of death stalking plague cities. Did it work? Probably not for the reasons they thought. The bacteria wasn't in the air, at least not for bubonic plague, but the costume did create distance. The long beak kept physicians farther from coughing patients. The covered skin prevented flea bites. Accidentally, the plague doctors stumbled onto protective gear that might have actually helped. Not through purifying air, through barrier protection. Other physicians tried more bizarre treatments. Mercury, arsenic, emeralds ground to powder, drinking urine, sitting in sewers, the theory being that worse air would drive out the less bad plague air. Letting snakes or toads touch the buboes to draw out poison. None of it worked. How could it? They were fighting bacteria with medieval superstition, using treatments developed for humoral imbalances against an infectious disease they couldn't see and didn't understand. Some treatments were purely magical. Amulets, prayers written on parchment and worn around the neck. Gemstones believed to have protective properties. Astrological talismans crafted under specific planetary alignments. Patients tried these too, not because they necessarily believed in magic, but because what else was there? Official medicine wasn't working. Prayer wasn't working. Maybe magic would work. Maybe desperation makes believers of us all. The wealthiest patients tried everything, hired the best physicians, bought the rarest ingredients, tried every treatment, every theory, every cure anyone suggested, and died anyway. Plague didn't respect wealth, didn't care about expensive doctors or rare medicines. The rich died like the poor. This was psychologically devastating for medieval society. Wealth was supposed to protect you, provide access to better food, better housing, better healthcare. During plague, It provided nothing. Money couldn't save you. Status couldn't save you. Knowledge couldn't save you. Some physicians recognized this, admitted their helplessness. The French physician Guy de Chauliac, who survived plague in Avignon, wrote, "It was useless and shameful for doctors to be there, as they dared not visit the sick for fear of being infected. And when they did visit them, they did nothing and earned nothing, for all the sick died." Brutal honesty. Physicians were useless, afraid, unable to help, charging fees for treatments that didn't work. De Chauliac continued practicing anyway, treating patients despite knowing his treatments were ineffective. Despite fear, despite the high probability of infection, he got infected, survived, one of the lucky ones. But his writings reveal the psychological toll, the shame of being helpless, the fear that drove many physicians to flee, the determination that kept some at their posts despite everything. Not all physicians fled. Many stayed, treated patients, knowing they'd probably die, doing it anyway. Why? Some from professional duty, the Hippocratic oath to help the sick, some from faith, belief that God protected those who served, some from simple human compassion. People were suffering, dying. Someone had to try to help. And one by one, the physicians who stayed got infected and died. The mortality rate among physicians was catastrophically high, far higher than the general population, because they exposed themselves constantly to sick patients, to infected fluids, to the very bacteria they were trying to cure. By the end of the first plague wave, Europe had lost most of its trained physicians. Universities scrambled to train replacements, relaxed standards, graduated students after shorter training periods. The quality of medical care declined, though given how ineffective medieval medicine was against plague, maybe quality didn't matter much. Some people turned to alternative healers, folk medicine, wise women, herbalists, people who'd never studied at universities but knew traditional remedies passed down through generations. Did their treatments work better? Probably not. Plague killed regardless. But maybe there was comfort in familiar remedies, in treatments from people you knew and trusted. Others turned to religious healing, pilgrimages to saints' shrines, relics believed to have protective or curative properties, mass prayers, processions through cities carrying holy objects. If medical science couldn't save you, perhaps faith could. It couldn't. The faithful died like everyone else, but faith provided something medicine couldn't. Meaning, the comfort that death wasn't random, that there was purpose even in suffering, that God had a plan, even if humans couldn't understand it. A small number of people stumbled onto something that actually helped. Isolation, quarantine, the idea that plague spread through contact, that avoiding sick people protected you. Venice and other Italian cities formalized this. Ships from infected ports forced to anchor offshore for 40 days. Suspected cases isolated from the general population. Plague houses sealed and marked. Basic public health measures that, had they been more widely adopted, might have slowed the spread. But most places didn't adopt these measures, or adopted them too late, or implemented them inconsistently, because the theory behind quarantine, that disease spreads through contact, contradicted the prevailing medical theory of miasma. If corrupted air caused plague, how did isolation help? You breathe the same air whether isolated or not. The few physicians who recognized contagion, that plague spread person to person, were ahead of their time. They couldn't explain the mechanism, didn't know about bacteria or transmission vectors, just observed that plague seemed to spread through contact. That avoiding sick people seemed protective. They were right. But lacking the microscopic evidence, lacking germ theory, they couldn't convince the medical establishment. Their observations were dismissed as coincidence, as correlation without causation. The humoral framework was too entrenched, too fundamental to medieval medicine to abandon based on mere observation. So the ineffective treatments continued: bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, prayers, amulets, everything except what might have actually helped. Isolation, sanitation, flea control, rat control. Medieval people noticed rats dying during plague outbreaks. Many observers recorded this. Rats dead in the streets, in houses, in unusual numbers. But they didn't connect rat deaths to human plague. Rats were vermin, unimportant. Their deaths were just another strange aspect of plague times. Not a clue to the disease's transmission. If they'd made the connection, rats to fleas to humans, they might have developed rat control measures. Might have slowed transmission, might have saved thousands of lives. But they didn't, couldn't. The conceptual framework didn't exist. Without microscopes, without bacteriology, the chain of transmission was invisible, so the plague continued, killed, spread, unstoppable, while physicians tried desperately to fight it with tools and theories utterly inadequate to the task. The failure of medieval medicine during plague had long-term consequences. It exposed the limitations of humoral theory, pushed some thinkers toward observation-based medicine, toward questioning ancient authorities like Galen, toward eventually, centuries later, developing germ theory and modern medicine. But that was the future. In 1348, in the midst of plague, there was only failure, helplessness, death, and physicians watching their patients die, knowing their knowledge was useless. Knowing all their training, all their study, all their theories couldn't save a single plague victim. Some broke under the strain, went mad, or fled, or turned to drink, or just gave up, stopped practicing, stopped trying. Others persisted, kept treating patients, kept trying remedies, kept hoping the next treatment might work, even knowing it probably wouldn't, because what else could they do? Admit defeat, abandon the sick. Better to try and fail than to not try at all. And occasionally, very rarely, a patient survived. Probably not because of treatment, probably because their immune system mounted an effective response, because they'd been exposed to a less lethal dose of bacteria, because random chance favored them. But the physicians didn't know that. When a patient survived, they credited the treatment, the bloodletting or the herbal remedy or the prayers, and they tried the same treatment on the next patient, who usually died. But hope is stubborn. The next survival was always just one patient away. This is the human side of medical failure, not just wrong theories, not just ineffective treatments, but real people trying desperately to save lives, using everything they knew, and watching it fail, again and again and again, without understanding, without effective tools, without any real hope of success, but trying anyway, because giving up meant letting people die without even attempting to save them. And that was unacceptable. The plague exposed the limits of medieval medicine, but it also showed the courage of medieval physicians, the ones who stayed, who tried, who died trying to help. They failed, but they tried, and that counts for something. The year is 1349. You're standing in a town square somewhere in Germany. It's noon. The sun is high, and you're watching something you never thought you'd see. A procession enters the square, maybe 200 people. Men, mostly. Some women, all dressed in simple robes, walking in formation, chanting, their faces twisted with religious fervor and pain. They're flagellants, and they're about to perform their ritual. The procession stops in the town centre. The flagellants arrange themselves in a circle, remove their upper robes, and begin. They beat themselves with whips. Leather cords tipped with metal studs striking their own backs, shoulders, arms. The sound of leather on flesh echoes across the square, again, and again, and again. Blood flows, streams down their backs, stains their remaining clothes, pools on the cobblestones beneath them. They don't stop, don't slow. The pain is the point. The blood is the offering. The suffering is the redemption. They believe this will stop the plague, that God sent the plague to punish humanity's sins, that the only way to appease divine wrath is through penance, through pain, through blood, through demonstrating that humans can punish themselves more severely than God needs to. This is medieval Christianity's response to plague. Not all of it, but a significant, terrifying part of it. The flagellant movement emerged in the early days of the Black Death, started in Austria and Germany, spread rapidly across Europe. At its peak, thousands participated, tens of thousands, travelling in groups from town to town, performing their bloody rituals in public squares, preaching repentance, warning of divine judgment. The theology was simple. God is just, God is wrathful. Humanity has sinned. Plague is punishment. The only escape is repentance. Not quiet, private repentance. Public, painful, blood-soaked repentance. Penance visible to all. Suffering offered to God as propitiation. The flagellants whipped themselves twice daily, in public, for 3.5 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life. They followed strict rules. No bathing, no changing clothes, no speaking to women, no sleeping in beds. Total devotion, total discipline, total submission to the cause. They claimed authority directly from God, didn't need the church's approval, didn't answer to bishops or priests. Their suffering gave them spiritual power. Their blood made them holy. Their pain made them prophets. The church was initially ambivalent. Some clergy supported the flagellants, saw them as genuinely pious, as expressing a valid response to catastrophe, as calling people to the repentance everyone knew was necessary. But others were suspicious, concerned about the anti-clerical elements in flagellant theology, the claim of direct divine authority that bypassed church hierarchy, the implicit criticism that official church sacraments weren't sufficient for salvation, that you needed to add blood, add suffering, add dramatic public penance, and there was violence. The flagellants didn't just whip themselves. They incited violence against others, against Jews particularly, against anyone they deemed insufficiently penitent. Their processions sometimes turned into riots, pogroms, massacres. In 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement, declared it heretical, ordered authorities to suppress it. Many flagellants were arrested, some executed. The movement fragmented, went underground, eventually faded. But while it lasted, it revealed something important about medieval religious psychology during plague. The desperate need for explanation, for meaning, for some framework that made the horror comprehensible. The church's official position was complex. Plague was divine punishment. Yes, but not purely punitive, also corrective. God disciplines those he loves. Suffering brings people closer to God, purifies, strengthens faith. The righteous who suffer and die go to heaven, a better fate than earthly survival. This theology provided comfort, sort of. Death wasn't meaningless, wasn't random. It was part of God's plan, served divine purposes beyond human understanding. The faithful who died were martyrs, saints, rewarded in eternity for their suffering in time, but it also created problems. If plague is punishment for sin, why do babies die? Infants who haven't sinned, children too young for moral culpability, their deaths don't fit the punishment framework. The church had answers. Original sin. Everyone is born fallen, tainted by Adam's transgression. Even infants carry that stain. Or the children aren't being punished. They're being spared greater suffering. Called to heaven early. A mercy, not a judgment. These answers satisfied some, troubled others. The theological gymnastics required to make innocent deaths compatible with divine justice strained credulity, especially when you're watching your child die, when abstraction meets reality, when theology confronts actual grief. Some people's faith deepened during plague, became stronger, more intense. They doubled down on devotion, attended more masses, gave more to the church, prayed more fervently. If plague is divine judgment, then the solution is more faith, more prayer, more submission to God's will. Religious art from this period reflects the intensity. Images of death become common. Skeletons, corpses, the danse macabre, the dance of death, showing skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, pope and beggar. Death doesn't discriminate. Everyone dances. These weren't meant to be depressing. They were memento mori, reminders of mortality, calls to focus on eternal salvation rather than temporal pleasure, reminders that this life is brief, that death comes to all, that only the soul's fate matters. The plague intensified this focus, made it visceral, real, urgent. You could die tomorrow, today, this hour. So prepare, confess sins, make peace with God, ensure your soul is ready, because the body won't last. Churches filled with people seeking last rites, confession, communion, the sacraments that prepared souls for death. Priests worked constantly, hearing confessions, administering rites, until they themselves fell sick, died, were replaced by other priests who'd work until they died. A grim assembly line of spiritual preparation for mass death. But not everyone's faith deepened. For some, it broke. If God allows this, if God causes this, if divine justice means babies dying and faithful prayers going unanswered and entire communities destroyed, then maybe God is not good. Maybe God is not loving. Maybe God is cruel, or absent, or dead. These thoughts were heresy, unspeakable, punishable by excommunication, by execution. But people thought them anyway, whispered them in the darkness, questioned in the privacy of their minds. Some stopped attending church, stopped praying, not defiantly, just stopped. Faith drained away like blood from a corpse, leaving emptiness. Nihilism. The universe is random, cruel, meaningless. We're alone. God isn't coming to save us. We're on our own. This existential crisis was almost as contagious as the plague. People watching their communities die. Their faiths crumble. Their certainties dissolve. What's left when everything you believed is revealed as insufficient? When the answers don't answer? When the comfort doesn't comfort? Some turned to mysticism, direct religious experience, not mediated by priests or church hierarchy, personal visions, divine revelations. ecstatic experiences. If the institutional church can't save you, maybe personal connection to God can. The plague years saw an explosion of mystical theology, saints and visionaries claiming direct communication with God, describing visions, prophecies, messages of hope or doom, or incomprehensible divine mysteries. Julian of Norwich, an English mystic, experienced her visions in 1373, just after a wave of plague. Her revelations of divine love describe God as all-loving, all-merciful. Her famous quote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." This is radically optimistic theology for plague times, asserting divine love when evidence suggests divine wrath, claiming future well-being when the present is catastrophic. It's faith persisting despite evidence. Or perhaps because of evidence, because the alternative, meaningless suffering, is unbearable. Others embraced apocalyptic theology. The plague is the end times, the tribulations described in Revelation. Christ will return soon. The world will end. The righteous will be saved. The wicked judged. This is all part of the prophesied sequence leading to the second coming. This theology provided meaning, structure, context. Yes, things are terrible, but they're supposed to be. This is prophesied. This is necessary. The worse things get, the closer we are to salvation, to Christ's return, to the end of suffering and the beginning of eternal peace. The apocalyptic framework made suffering tolerable, not meaningless, not random, but part of a cosmic plan, part of the story arc leading to a happy ending. Endure now, salvation is coming. Soon. Of course, salvation didn't come. Christ didn't return. The plague eventually ended. The world continued. The apocalyptic predictions proved false. But during the plague, they provided comfort, hope, purpose. The church itself struggled with the plague's theological implications. If God is all-powerful and all good, why does evil exist? This is the problem of theodicy, theology's oldest question. The plague made it urgent, immediate, impossible to ignore. Different theologians offered different answers. Free will. Humanity chose sin. God allows consequences. The plague is natural law operating, not specific divine intervention, just the universe functioning according to its created nature. Or suffering builds character, strengthens faith, purifies souls. The plague is harsh medicine, but ultimately beneficial, like a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh to save the body. God cuts away corruption through plague to save humanity's soul. Or, we can't understand God's purposes. Divine wisdom is infinite. Human understanding finite. The plague serves purposes beyond our comprehension. We must trust God, even when we don't understand. Faith means believing without full knowledge. All these answers appear in plague, error sermons and writings. Different theologians emphasizing different frameworks, all trying to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in the meaningless, to preserve faith in the face of catastrophic challenge. The plague didn't destroy Christianity. The religion survived, adapted, but it changed. The easy confidence of pre-plague theology was gone, replaced by something darker, more aware of suffering, more focused on death and judgment, less certain that faith guarantees earthly protection. Pre-plague Christianity emphasized God's immanence, his involvement in daily life, his provision and protection for the faithful. Post-plague Christianity emphasized transcendence, God's otherness, the gap between divine and human, the unknowability of divine purposes. This shift affects European Christianity for centuries. the Protestant Reformation's emphasis on divine sovereignty, on predestination, on the fundamental corruption of humanity and the absolute necessity of grace. These theological developments are rooted partly in plague, error questioning of divine justice and human worth. But that's long-term consequence. In the immediate term, during the plague, religious interpretation mostly served psychological needs. People needed the suffering to mean something, needed death to have purpose, needed to believe the horror served some higher good, so they flagellated themselves, or deepened their devotion, or turned mystical, or embraced apocalypse, or quietly lost faith, each person finding whatever framework helped them endure. The Church blessed the dying, buried the dead, maintained rituals even as the ritual's efficacy was questioned, provided structure, community, continuity. In a world dissolving into chaos, the Church was stability, even if that stability was partly illusion. And when the plague ended, when the survivors emerged from their homes and looked at the devastated world, the Church was still there, damaged, questioned, changed, but there, ready to help rebuild, to provide meaning for the aftermath, to shape the new world emerging from the ashes of the old. But first, during the plague, when people needed someone to blame, when fear demanded explanation and pain demanded outlet, the Church sometimes pointed to scapegoats, or failed to stop others from pointing, or looked away while scapegoats were slaughtered. Faith couldn't save them, so they turned on each other. The year is 1348. You're Jewish, living in a small community in the Rhineland. Maybe 500 Jews in your town, among thousands of Christians. You've lived here for generations. Your family runs a business, pays taxes, follows the laws. Mostly you coexist peacefully with Christian neighbors. Then the plague arrives, and everything changes. At first, it's just rumors, whispers in the marketplace. Jews are causing the plague, poisoning wells, using dark magic, conspiring to destroy Christendom. The accusations are absurd. Jews are dying from plague too. But logic doesn't matter when people are terrified. The whispers get louder. A priest gives a sermon, suggests that maybe the Jews are to blame, doesn't say it directly, just implies, asks questions. Why do the Jews sometimes seem to suffer less? Why are their communities not as devastated? Could there be a reason? There are reasons. None involve conspiracy. Jewish communities often have better sanitation, ritual washing, dietary laws that happen to reduce exposure to certain disease vectors, higher literacy rates that allow faster spread of protective knowledge, tighter community bonds that enable better mutual support. But these explanations require nuance, understanding, comanalysis. People dying of plague aren't interested in nuance. They want simple answers. They want someone to blame. The accusations intensify. Someone claims they saw Jews throwing powder into a well. Someone else says they found evidence of Jewish plots. Letters. Confessions extracted under torture. All of it fabricated or coerced. All of it false. But believed anyway because people want to believe. Need to believe. The Christian community turns. Neighbors you've known for years avoid you. Stop buying from your shop. Stop speaking to you. The children your children played with yesterday throw stones today. The hatred builds. Visible. Tangible. Terrifying. You try to leave. Pack what you can. Flee to another town. But where? The accusations are everywhere. The hatred is spreading faster than the plague. There's nowhere safe. Nowhere that will welcome Jews when Christian populations are screaming for scapegoats. Then The mob comes. It starts in the evening. You hear shouting, see torches, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, coming toward the Jewish quarter, chanting, cursing, armed with clubs, knives, tools turned into weapons. You bar your door, gather your family in the back room, pray, hope the mob will pass, that the authorities will intervene, that sanity will prevail. The authorities don't intervene. Sometimes they lead the mob. Sometimes they just watch. Sometimes they try to stop it and are overwhelmed. The mob is too large, too angry, too certain they're doing God's work, punishing the people responsible for the plague, protecting Christendom from Jewish malice. They break down your door, drag you into the street. You see neighbors dragged from their homes, children, elderly, everyone. The mob doesn't discriminate. All Jews are guilty. All deserve punishment. Some are killed immediately, beaten to death, stabbed. The mob is frenzied, beyond reason, beyond mercy. They're not just killing. They're releasing rage, fear, helplessness in the face of plague. All of it channeled into violence against a designated enemy. Others are arrested, herded into the synagogue. The building is barred from the outside, locked, then set on fire. You're inside, hundreds of you, trapped. The smoke rises, the heat intensifies. The screams are deafening. You try to break down the door. It won't budge. The windows are too small, too high. There's no escape. The fire burns, you die, your family dies, your entire community dies. Burned alive in the synagogue your ancestors built. Killed for a plague you didn't cause. Killed for being different, for being vulnerable, for being convenient scapegoats. This happened over and over across Europe during the plague years. Strasbourg 1349, 2,000 Jews burned alive. Basel same year, 600 dead. Freiburg, Cologne, Mainz, Erfurt, Worms, city after city, massacre after massacre. The pattern was consistent. Accusations of well poisoning, confessions extracted through torture, mob violence, authorities either participating or failing to prevent, mass killings, theft of Jewish property, destruction of Jewish communities that had existed for centuries. Pope Clement VI tried to stop it, issued papal bulls in 1348 pointing out the obvious: Jews were dying from plague too. If they caused it, why would they suffer from it? The accusations made no sense. The violence must stop. The bulls were ignored. Local clergy often contradicted the Pope, encouraged or at least tolerated the violence, saw Jewish deaths as divine justice, or didn't care, or were too afraid of their own Christian congregations to oppose the mob. Some secular authorities tried to protect Jewish communities. Philip VI of France, Pedro IV of Aragon, Casimir II of Poland, they recognized the accusations were false, tried to prevent massacres, sometimes succeeded, often failed. The mob had momentum, had conviction, believed they were doing God's work, purifying Christendom, removing the source of plague. Authorities who opposed this were accused of being in league with Jews, of betraying Christianity, of allowing the plague to continue by protecting its alleged perpetrators. So many authorities stepped aside, let the mob do what it wanted. Some actively participated, saw opportunity in Jewish deaths to seize property, cancel debts, remove economic competition. The plague created cover for violence that would have been harder to justify in normal times. The economic motive was often as important as the religious one. Medieval Jews were often moneylenders. Christian doctrine prohibited usury, lending money at interest. Jewish law allowed it with certain restrictions. So Jews filled the niche, provided necessary financial services, and accumulated debts from Christian borrowers. Kill the Jewish lender, and the debt dies with them. Simple. Effective. Morally reprehensible, but tempting to borrowers who saw opportunity in plague, era chaos. Why repay debts when you can kill the creditor and take their property too? This economic violence was dressed in religious language. Jews as Christ killers, as enemies of Christianity, as plague spreaders. But the underlying motive was often simple theft. Greed enabled by catastrophe and disguised as righteousness. Not all Christians participated. Some protected their Jewish neighbors, hid them, helped them escape, spoke against the violence. These righteous few risked their own lives, bucking the mob, defending the hated, maintaining humanity when society was collapsing into barbarism. But they were the minority. Most Christians either participated in the violence, supported it passively, or did nothing. Fear is powerful. Social pressure is powerful. And standing against a mob requires courage most people don't have. The plague created conditions where the worst human impulses flourished. Fear became hatred. Helplessness became violence. The need for explanation became scapegoating, and vulnerable minorities paid the price. Jews weren't the only scapegoats. Lepers were accused of poisoning wells in alliance with Jews, massacred in some regions. Beggars, foreigners, pilgrims, anyone different, anyone vulnerable, anyone who could be blamed. In some places, Roma people, gypsies, though that's now considered a slur, were targeted, accused of spreading plague deliberately, of witchcraft, of crimes real or imagined, killed, driven out, their otherness making them targets. Women, particularly elderly women, faced accusations of witchcraft, of causing plague through magic, through deals with demons, through malice toward their communities. Some were executed, burned, drowned. The witch hunts that would peak in later centuries had roots in plague-era scapegoating. The mentally ill were targeted too, their strange behavior interpreted as demonic possession, as evidence of plague causing magic. They were killed, or locked away, or driven from communities, blamed for catastrophes they couldn't understand, let alone cause. The pattern was universal. Find the vulnerable, blame them, kill them, steal from them, feel like you've done something, like you've fought back against the plague, like you've protected your community, even though you've actually just committed murder. The scapegoating served psychological functions. It provided explanation in the face of mystery, control in the face of helplessness, action in the face of passivity. It transformed victims, people suffering from plague, into agents, people who could fight back, who could identify enemies and destroy them. It didn't stop the plague. Of course it didn't. Killing Jews didn't reduce plague deaths. Often it made things worse. Jewish communities destroyed meant economic networks disrupted, trade reduced, resources wasted, social cohesion damaged. But the mob didn't care about consequences. They cared about immediate emotional relief, the satisfaction of violence, the illusion of control, the comfort of simple answers to complex questions. By the time the first plague wave ended in 1353, Jewish populations in many parts of Europe were devastated, not by plague, by murder. Entire communities erased, centuries of Jewish culture and scholarship destroyed, families that had lived in European cities for generations driven out or killed. Some Jewish populations fled east, to Poland, to Lithuania, to regions where authorities offered more protection. This eastward migration reshaped European Jewish demographics for centuries, creating the Ashkenazi communities of Eastern Europe that would thrive until the Holocaust. Another scapegoating catastrophe nearly destroyed them. The plague era massacres left deep scars. Jewish communities became more insular, less trusting of Christian neighbours, more mobile, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The trauma echoed through generations. And for Christian Europe, the massacres revealed something dark, something that would resurface repeatedly. The willingness to scapegoat, to dehumanize, to commit atrocities and call them righteous, to kill the vulnerable and claim divine approval. The plague didn't create anti-Semitism. That existed long before. But the plague intensified it, normalized it, showed how quickly neighbor could turn on neighbor, how thin the veneer of civilization really was, how fear could transform ordinary people into murderers. When the plague ended, when the survivors emerged and looked at what they'd done, there was little accountability. Few prosecutions for the massacres, little attempt to restore stolen property, little acknowledgement of injustice. Instead, there was silence, and occasional guilt, and the slow reconstruction of societies that had revealed themselves as capable of extraordinary cruelty when afraid. The scapegoats were dead. The plague was fading, and the world had to figure out how to continue. The year is 1353. The plague's first wave is over, not ended, not eradicated. But the massive pandemic transmission has stopped. The explosive death rates have slowed. Europe can breathe, can begin to assess the damage, can try to understand what just happened. You're a survivor. You don't feel lucky. You feel haunted. You've watched half the people you knew die. Your spouse, 2 of your 3 children, your parents, your siblings, most of your friends gone, dead, buried in mass graves or burned or left to rot because there was no one to bury them. You're one of the fortunate ones. You survived. Your body fought off the infection, or you avoided exposure, or pure random chance favored you. You're alive, but the world you knew is dead. Walk through your city. Half the houses are empty, doors standing open, interiors visible from the street, furniture still in place, possessions scattered, but no people. The inhabitants are dead, or fled. The houses just stand there, silent, waiting for occupants who'll never return. The markets are quiet. Maybe a third of the stalls operating. The merchants who remain charge high prices, not from greed, though some are greedy, but because supply chains are broken. Labor is scarce, transport is expensive. Everything costs more when half the workforce is dead. You need new clothes. Your children, the one who survived, is growing, needs new shoes. You go to the cobbler. He's new, young. The old cobbler died. This one trained under him for only a few months before the master died, and the apprentice inherited the shop. The shoes are poorly made, more expensive than before, but they're shoes. You buy them. This pattern repeats everywhere. The skilled craftspeople dead, replaced by less skilled apprentices or newcomers. Quality declining, prices rising. The entire economy adjusting to radical labor shortage. The fields outside the city are partly abandoned. You can see them from the walls. Sections overgrown, returning to forest. No one to work them. The farmers who survived have choices now. They can demand better wages, better conditions, or they can leave. Find better opportunities elsewhere. Many leave. Rural populations flowing to cities, to opportunities, To freedom from the old feudal obligations that feel absurd now. Half the village is dead. The lord is demanding the same rents, the same labour. As if nothing changed. Why stay? Why not seek something better? The lords panic. They're losing workers, losing income, losing control. They appeal to the king, to parliament. Pass laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding workers from leaving their lands, trying to legally enforce the old system. The laws fail. Workers ignore them. What are the authorities going to do? Imprison everyone? Kill the remaining workers? They need the labour. They have to compromise. Wages rise. Rents fall. Working conditions improve. The balance of power shifts. This is the beginning of the end of feudalism. Not immediate. Not dramatic. But the plague broke something, made the old system unsustainable, created labour scarcity that gave common people leverage they'd never had. Within a century, serfdom will be declining across Western Europe. The plague started it. But in 1353, this is still uncertain, still emerging. What's certain is that everything has changed. The economy, the social structure, the population, the psychology of the survivors. Let's talk numbers. Europe's population before the plague was roughly 125 million. After the plague, maybe 75 million, 50 million dead, 40% of the population gone. In 5 years, some regions suffered more. Mediterranean areas lost 60 to 70%. Some villages lost everyone. 100% mortality. The village still stands, empty houses, overgrown gardens, silent streets. But the people are gone. Every single one, dead. The last survivor dying alone. Their body not discovered for weeks, months, until travellers pass through and find the ghost town. Other regions suffered less. Parts of Poland, Bohemia, remote rural areas, they lost 20 to 30%. Catastrophic, but not civilizationally threatening. Enough survivors to maintain continuity, to keep the community functioning. Cities universally suffered more than countryside. Dense populations, rapid transmission, poor sanitation. Cities lost 50 to 70%, some more. Florence dropped from 120,000 to maybe 50,000. Venice from 110,000 to 60,000. Siena lost 2/3, Hamburg lost 2/3, Bristol lost half. The great cities of Europe were gutted, not destroyed, but damaged so severely it would take generations to recover. Some never fully did. Siena never regained its pre-plague population, never rebuilt its pre-plague economy. The plague broke something permanently. The demographic impact extended beyond immediate death. The plague killed disproportionately among young adults, the people of prime reproductive age. This created a demographic echo, a generation gap. Fewer children born in the decade after plague, because there were fewer adults of childbearing age. It also created a marriage market distortion. More women survived than men, possibly because women had less exposure in certain occupations, or because female physiology offered some protection or random chance. Whatever the reason, surviving men had multiple women competing for marriage. Dowries dropped. Women's bargaining power in marriage decreased. But in the labour market, women gained. With men scarce, women filled roles previously closed to them, became brewers, merchants, craftspeople, ran businesses, inherited property. The plague created opportunities for women that wouldn't have existed in the normal course of medieval society. Widows particularly gained. In medieval law, widows often inherited their husband's property. With so many men dead, many women became property owners, business owners, economically independent. This wasn't universal. Laws varied by region. but it was significant. The plague created a class of independent women that had barely existed before. Children suffered devastatingly. Orphans numbered in the millions. Entire families wiped out, leaving children alone. Relatives took some. Monasteries and convents took others. Many were simply abandoned, left to beg, to steal, to survive however they could. Cities established orphanages, charitable institutions to house and feed children who'd lost everyone. These were grim places, overcrowded, underfunded, high mortality, but better than the streets, better than starvation. The psychological impact on survivors is hard to measure, but clearly enormous. Everyone was traumatized. Everyone had watched people die, lost loved ones, lived in fear for months or years, survived experiences that would break most modern people, even with therapy and support systems. They didn't have therapy. They didn't have psychological support. They had faith if they still believed. They had work if they could find it. They had community if any remained. They had to endure, to carry the trauma, to function despite it. Some couldn't. Mental illness increased. Depression, what we'd now recognize as PTSD, anxiety disorders, psychosis. People broken by what they'd witnessed, unable to function, unable to recover. They were cared for if families survived, or locked away, or left to beg, or they died. Medieval society had limited capacity for dealing with mental illness, but most survivors coped, found ways to continue, had to continue, because giving up meant death, and they'd survived this long, they'd endure. The artistic and cultural impact of the plague was profound. Pre-plague European art was often optimistic, focused on beauty, on divine glory, on the splendor of creation. Post-plague art became darker, more focused on death, on suffering, on the transience of life. The Danse Macabre appeared everywhere, painted on church walls, carved in stone, depicted in manuscripts, images of skeletons dancing with the living, leading them to graves. Death as universal, inevitable, coming for everyone regardless of wealth or status. Memento mori became a dominant theme. Remember you will die. Skulls in artwork, decaying corpses, worms and rot. Not to depress, but to focus, to remind viewers that earthly life is temporary, that only the soul's fate matters, that death can come at any time. This was therapeutic in a way, acknowledging death, making it visible, incorporating it into daily awareness. This might have helped survivors process trauma, made the unthinkable thinkable, the unspeakable speakable. Literature changed too. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron was written in 1353, set during the plague. Tells stories of young people who fled Florence to escape plague, spend their time telling stories. Some funny, some tragic, some erotic, all attempting to find meaning and enjoyment despite catastrophe. The work captures plague-era psychology, the recognition that life is short, that pleasure matters, that stories connect us, that humanity persists even in, especially in dark times. It became one of the most influential works in Western literature. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales shows plague's influence too, written decades later, but shaped by plague memory. The framing device, pilgrims travelling together, telling stories, reflects post-plague religious devotion. The mix of classes, knight, merchant, peasant, clergy, reflects the social mobility the plague created. Education changed. Universities had lost faculty to plague, lost students, lost funding. They had to rebuild, recruit new scholars, often from lower social classes than previously. The plague democratized education somewhat, opened opportunities previously restricted to the wealthy. Medical education evolved. Slowly, the plague exposed how inadequate medieval medicine was. Some physicians began questioning Galen, questioning humoral theory, beginning the long, slow process that would eventually lead to modern medicine. Not immediately, but the seeds were planted, legal systems adapted, inheritance laws, property law, contract law, all had to adjust to plague reality. What happens when both parties to a contract die, when heirs can't be located, when entire family lines end? Medieval law wasn't built for this. It had to evolve fast, create new precedents, new frameworks. The church evolved too, lost authority in some ways. People had prayed. The prayers didn't stop the plague. Priests had administered sacraments. The faithful died anyway. This damaged the church's claim to mediate between humanity and God. But the church also gained in some ways. Post-plague religious devotion increased. People frightened by plague, by mortality, by divine judgment, they gave more to the church, went on more pilgrimages, built more chapels, endowed more masses for the dead. The cult of saints intensified, particularly plague saints. Saint Sebastian, martyred by arrows, associated with plague. Saint Roch, who'd cared for plague victims. These saints became focal points for devotion, for prayers asking protection from future plague, because the plague came back, not immediately, but it came back, recurring waves, 1361, 1369, 1374, 1375, every decade or so through the rest of the 14th century, smaller outbreaks, lower death tolls than the Black Death, but still killing thousands, still traumatizing communities, still reminding everyone that the threat hadn't ended. These recurring waves shaped European psychology for centuries. Plague as perpetual threat, as divine judgment that could return at any time, as the sword of Damocles hanging over civilization, shaping behavior, shaping faith, shaping how people thought about life and death and meaning. The plague transformed Europe demographically, economically, socially, psychologically, culturally, religiously. Nothing was the same after 1353. The medieval world that existed in 1346 was gone. What emerged was something new, built on ruins, shaped by trauma, carrying the scars forever. The survivors inherited a world of empty houses and abandoned fields and new opportunities and deep psychological wounds. They had to rebuild, had to create new systems, new societies, new meanings. And they did. Slowly, painfully, the Europe that emerged in the 15th century, the Renaissance, the age of exploration, the beginning of modernity, was built on the ashes of the plague, shaped by the catastrophe, carrying forward both the trauma and the transformations the plague created. But that transformation came with a cost paid in blood, in suffering, in millions of lives cut short, in communities destroyed, in knowledge lost, in trauma carried forward through generations. The plague destroyed one world and created another. The survivors had to live in both, remembering what was lost while building what would come next. The silence that followed the plague was not peaceful. It was the silence of emptiness, of absence, of a world that had been hollowed out and was now slowly, painfully, learning to breathe again. But in that silence, something unexpected was happening. The very foundations of medieval society, foundations that had seemed as permanent as the mountains, as unchangeable as the seasons, were beginning to crack. For centuries, Europe had been built on a rigid hierarchy. At the top, the nobility and the church. At the bottom, The peasants, the vast majority of the population who worked the land and had almost no rights, no freedom, no hope of rising above their station. This system, feudalism, depended on one critical thing, an abundance of labour. There were always more peasants than land, more workers than work, and so the lords could demand anything they wanted. They could pay as little as they wished. They could impose any condition, any obligation. The peasants had no choice but to accept. Where else could they go? What else could they do? But the Black Death changed the equation. Overnight, there were not too many workers. There were too few. Fields lay unplowed because there was no one to plough them. Crops rotted in the ground because there was no one to harvest them. Mills stood silent because there was no one to grind the grain. For the first time in centuries, labour was more valuable than land, and the peasants knew it. In England, a labourer who had earned 2p a day before the plague could now demand 4, sometimes 6, sometimes more. The lords were outraged. This was against the natural order of things. This was rebellion, heresy, chaos. In 1349, King Edward III passed the Statute of Labourers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It declared that all able-bodied persons under 60 must work, and must accept the same wages they had received before 1346. The penalty for refusing was imprisonment, but the law was impossible to enforce. There simply weren't enough workers. If a peasant didn't like his lord's terms, he could walk to the next manor, and the next lord would hire him gladly, law or no law. For the first time, peasants had leverage, and they used it. They demanded higher wages, better conditions, the right to leave their manors, to sell their labour to the highest bidder. Some even demanded freedom from serfdom entirely, and often they got what they demanded, because the alternative was fields lying fallow, estates falling into ruin, the nobility watching their wealth evaporate, while they clung stubbornly to traditions that no longer worked. The transformation was not immediate. It was not universal, but it was real. In some regions, serfdom began to crumble within a generation. In England, by the early 15th century, the majority of peasants were free, not serfs bound to the land, but labourers who could move, who could negotiate, who had rights. The plague had not liberated them out of kindness or justice. It had liberated them through sheer arithmetic. There were too few of them left to be taken for granted, but the transformation went deeper than wages and freedom of movement. The plague had shattered the psychological chains as well as, for centuries, the church had taught that earthly suffering was to be endured, that the social order was divinely ordained, that a peasant born poor should accept his poverty as God's will. But then God had sent a plague that killed rich and poor alike, that struck down bishops as readily as beggars, that made a mockery of prayers and processions and penances. If the social order was divinely ordained, why had God destroyed it? If the church was holy, why had its priests died like everyone else, and often died first because they tended to the sick? The plague had posed a question that the old answers could not satisfy, and in the space that question created, new ideas began to grow. In England in 1381, 5 years after the Black Death, the peasants' revolt erupted. Tens of thousands of workers, emboldened by their newfound economic power and enraged by attempts to roll back their gains, marched on London. Their demands were radical an end to serfdom, equality before the law, the redistribution of church wealth, the execution of corrupt officials. Their rallying cry, attributed to the preacher John Ball, was revolutionary: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, in the beginning, before society was divided into nobles and peasants, weren't all people equal? Wasn't this hierarchy a human invention, not a divine decree? The revolt was crushed. Its leaders were executed, but the ideas did not die. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe. In France, the Jacquerie. In Florence, the Ciompi revolt. Each was suppressed, but each left cracks in the edifice of feudalism. The plague had shown the common people that the world could change, that the old certainties were not certain after all, that even the mightiest could fall. And once that knowledge took root, it could not be uprooted. The transformation extended to women as well, though more subtly, more gradually, more ambiguously. Before the plague, women's roles were severely restricted. Noble women might manage estates in their husband's absence, but common women had few opportunities beyond marriage and motherhood. Most professions were closed to them. Most guilds refused them membership. After the plague, necessity created openings. With so many men dead, women took on roles they had never been allowed before. They ran shops, managed farms, joined guilds, worked as blacksmiths, brewers, butchers, even physicians. In some cities, widows inherited their husbands' businesses and continued to operate them successfully. In some guilds, women were admitted for the first time because there simply weren't enough men to fill the ranks. This was not equality. Far from it. Women were still paid less than men for the same work. They still faced legal restrictions and social prejudice. And as the population recovered and men became plentiful again, many of these gains were rolled back. But for a few decades, in the chaos and desperation after the plague, women had glimpsed possibilities, and some of those possibilities endured. The cultural transformation was perhaps the most profound of all. Before the plague, medieval art was dominated by images of heaven, Christ in glory, the Virgin enthroned, saints in golden haloes. The focus was on the eternal, the divine, the otherworldly. After the plague, a new theme emerged: death. Not death as a peaceful transition to paradise, but death as a grinning skeleton, a decaying corpse, a grotesque reminder of mortality. The most famous expression of this was the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. In paintings, woodcuts, and poems, death is depicted leading a procession of people from all walks of life. Pope and peasant, king and beggar, all of them dancing toward the grave. The message was unmistakable: death comes for everyone. Wealth cannot stop it. Power cannot delay it. Piety cannot prevent it. All are equal in the end. It was a message the plague had taught with brutal clarity. Another motif became common: the transi-tomb, a burial monument showing the deceased in two forms. On top, a carved figure of the person as they were in life, healthy, dignified, beautifully dressed. Below, a second carving of the same person as a rotting corpse, sometimes being devoured by worms and toads. What you are, I once was. The inscription often read, what I am, you will be. It was a memento mori, a reminder of death, not to inspire despair, but to urge people to live rightly, to remember their mortality, to not grow too proud or too attached to worldly things. But there was another effect as well. By emphasizing the brevity of life, the fragility of existence, these works also emphasized the preciousness of the present moment. If life was short, then perhaps it should be lived fully. If death could come at any time, then perhaps every day mattered. This shift in perspective would eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the flowering of art, literature, science, and humanism that began in Italy in the late 14th century and spread across Europe. The Renaissance is often described as a rebirth of classical learning, a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, and that is true. But it was also a response to the trauma of the plague, a determination to celebrate life in the face of death, to create beauty in a world that had been made ugly, to assert human dignity and potential in the aftermath of a catastrophe that had reduced humans to rotting corpses in mass graves. The great Renaissance artists, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, were born into a world shaped by the plague. Their works, full of life and movement and emotion, were in some sense a repudiation of the skeletal grin of the dance macabre. They said, yes, we die, but first, we live, and what we create while we live can be glorious. The economic transformation was as dramatic as the social and cultural ones. Before the plague, Europe's economy was agrarian and stagnant. Most people lived on the edge of subsistence. There was little surplus, little trade, little innovation. After the plague, labour shortages drove up wages, and higher wages meant more purchasing power. Peasants who had once eaten bread and porridge could now afford meat, cheese, beer. They could buy cloth, tools, household goods. This increased demand stimulated production. It encouraged trade. It rewarded efficiency and innovation. Landlords who could not compete by offering higher wages turned to other strategies. They invested in technology, better ploughs, water mills, windmills. They consolidated holdings, turning from labour-intensive grain farming to less labour-intensive sheep farming. England, in particular, became a major wool producer, exporting raw wool and finished cloth across Europe. The wealth generated by this trade funded the growth of cities, the rise of a merchant class, the development of banking and credit. By the late 15th century, Europe's economy was more dynamic, more diversified, more interconnected than it had been before the plague. The catastrophe had, paradoxically, laid the groundwork for prosperity. But this transformation came at a cost. The shift from grain to sheep meant that common lands that peasants had traditionally used for grazing their own animals or gathering firewood, were enclosed, fenced off, reserved for the landlord's flocks. This enclosure movement, which accelerated in the 16th century, displaced thousands of peasants, turning them into landless labourers or beggars. The freedom and prosperity that some gained, others lost. The Black Death had not created a utopia. It had reshuffled the deck, redistributed power and wealth, but it had not eliminated inequality or injustice. Still, the world after the plague was not the same as the world before. The rigid hierarchies had been shaken. The certainties had been questioned. The possibilities had expanded. In the strange, terrible calculus of history, the plague had been both destroyer and creator. It had ended one world and begun another. And as the survivors looked around at the landscape of their new reality, they did so with a mixture of grief for what had been lost and wonder at what might yet be built. The Black Death did not end in 1353. It would have been easier, perhaps, if it had. If the Great Dying had been a singular catastrophe, a storm that raged and then passed, leaving the survivors to rebuild in peace. But the plague did not vanish. It lingered. It returned, again and again and again. The second wave came in 1361, just 8 years after the first had subsided. It was called the Pestis Secunda, the second pestilence, and though it was not as deadly as the first, it was perhaps more cruel, because this time it struck primarily the young. The children born during or just after the Black Death, the generation that had never known the horror, that represented hope and renewal, they were the ones who died. Contemporary chroniclers called it the mortality of children. Entire cohorts were wiped out. Families that had survived the first wave intact were shattered by the second. And then it came again in 1369, and again in 1374, and again in 1400. For the next 3 centuries, Europe experienced plague outbreaks every 10 to 20 years. Some were localized, affecting only a single city or region. Others swept across entire countries. None were as catastrophic as the Black Death of 1347-1353, but each took its toll. Each left a trail of bodies, grief, and trauma. London suffered major plague outbreaks in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and 1665. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed an estimated 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. In 1656, a plague outbreak in Naples killed perhaps half the population. In 1679, Vienna lost a third of its inhabitants. Plague became a recurring feature of European life, not a singular catastrophe, but a persistent threat. Something that came and went like a dark tide, each time washing away thousands of lives. People learned to live with the possibility. They learned to watch for the signs, swellings, fever, the telltale buboes. They learned to flee when plague arrived, and to pray when flight was not an option. And they learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to reduce its spread. Quarantine, first implemented in Ragusa and Venice during the Black Death, became standard practice. Ships arriving from plague-infected regions were held in isolation for 40 days, 40 giorni, in Italian, from which we get the word quarantine. Cities developed plague protocols. When an outbreak occurred, houses with infected residents were sealed shut, with the inhabitants locked inside, healthy and sick alike. A red cross was painted on the door, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Guards were posted to ensure no one left. Food was passed through windows, and the occupants waited either to recover or to die. It was brutal. Families trapped together watched each other sicken and die, unable to escape, unable to seek help. The healthy were often infected by the sick. The trauma of those locked plague houses is almost unimaginable, but it worked, at least partially. By isolating the sick, cities could slow the spread. Not stop it entirely, but buy time, reduce casualties. Other measures were implemented as well. During outbreaks, public gatherings were banned. Markets were closed. Theatres, taverns, and churches were shuttered. Bodies were no longer buried in churchyards within the city walls, but in mass graves outside the city. Plague pits, they were called. In London, these pits can still be found beneath modern buildings, full of bones stacked layer upon layer. Fires were lit in the streets, in the belief that smoke would purify the air. Herbs were burned. Vinegar was splashed on doorsteps. Pomanders, perforated balls filled with aromatic spices, were carried and sniffed constantly. None of these measures addressed the true cause, but some, accidentally, helped. The fires and the vinegar may not have purified the air, but the quarantines and the restrictions on movement did slow transmission. And slowly, very slowly, the plague began to loosen its grip. The last major outbreak in Western Europe was the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720, which killed an estimated 100 Saracen people in southern France. After that, the plague retreated from Europe, not because it was eradicated, but because it withdrew back to its ancient reservoirs in Central Asia, where it remains to this day, circulating among rodent populations. Why did it stop? Historians and scientists have debated this for decades. Some credit the quarantine measures and public health improvements. By the 18th century, European cities had become better at isolating outbreaks before they could spread. Others point to changes in housing, as wooden structures were replaced by stone and brick, and as people moved away from thatched roofs and earthen floors, the habitats of rats and fleas were disrupted. There were fewer opportunities for the bacteria to jump from rodents to humans. Still others suggest that the black rat, Rattus rattus, the primary carrier, was displaced by the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which is less likely to live in close proximity to humans. There may have been genetic changes as well, both in humans and in the bacteria. Some researchers have found evidence that survivors of the plague passed on genetic resistance to their descendants, and the bacteria itself may have evolved into less violent strains. Or it may simply have been chance. The plague's retreat may have had less to do with human action and more to do with ecological shifts that we do not fully understand. What is certain is that the plague left an indelible mark on Europe and on the world. Culturally, it shaped everything that came after. The literature, the art, the philosophy of the late medieval and early modern periods are all haunted by the memory of mass death. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the Black Death, is a collection of stories told by 10 young people who have fled Florence to escape the plague. Its themes, love, death, fortune, the fragility of life, are all coloured by the catastrophe unfolding around them. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the aftermath of the plague, presents a cross-section of English society from knight to miller to pardoner. It is a snapshot of a world in transition, where old hierarchies are fraying and new social dynamics are emerging. Shakespeare, writing in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, lived through multiple plague outbreaks. London's theatres were frequently closed during epidemics. His plays, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, Macbeth, are filled with images of disease, contagion, and mortality. The plague was not just a historical event. It became a metaphor, a symbol, a lens through which people understood suffering, chaos, and the precariousness of existence. In medicine, the plague forced a reckoning. The failure of traditional approaches, Galenic humours, bloodletting, prayers, discredited many long-held beliefs. Physicians began to look for new explanations, new treatments. The scientific method, with its emphasis on observation and experimentation, began to take root. By the 17th century, pioneers like William Harvey were dissecting bodies and challenging ancient authorities. By the 19th century, germ theory would finally explain what miasma theory never could. The Black Death did not cause the scientific revolution, but it contributed to the climate of questioning and innovation that made it possible. Politically, the plague accelerated the decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized nation-states. As power shifted from local lords to kings and queens, as economies became more monetized and less dependent on land, the modern state began to take shape. The The same labour shortages that empowered peasants also forced governments to become more efficient, more bureaucratic, more responsive to economic realities. And psychologically, the plague changed how people saw themselves and their place in the world. Before the Black Death, life was often viewed as a journey toward an afterlife, a test of faith, a preparation for eternity. Suffering was to be endured because heaven awaited. After the plague, that certainty was shaken. If the righteous died alongside the wicked, if prayers went unanswered, if God's plan was inscrutable to the point of seeming random, then perhaps the focus should shift to this life, not the next. This shift, however subtle, however gradual, helped lay the groundwork for the humanism of the Renaissance and, eventually, the secularism of the Enlightenment. The plague taught a harsh lesson that life is fragile, that death is universal, that meaning must be found not in divine guarantees, but in human action and creation. And across the centuries, that lesson echoed. In art, in literature, in philosophy, in science, in politics, the Black Death was not just a pandemic. It was a dividing line, a turning point, a rupture that separated the medieval world from the modern. It killed tens of millions. It destroyed empires. It reshaped economies and societies and cultures. But it also, in ways both terrible and unexpected, created space for new ideas, new possibilities, new worlds. And as the last plague pits were covered over, as the memory faded from living experience into history, the legacy remained woven into the fabric of everything that came after. There is a churchyard in England, in a village called Highjump, where the story is written in stone. In 1665, the plague came to Highjump. It arrived in a bundle of cloth from London, damp with infection, and within days the tailor who received it was dead. The villagers knew what was coming. They had heard the stories. They knew that plague spread, that it jumped from town to town, that flight was the only hope. But the village rector, William Mompesson, made an extraordinary request. He asked the villagers not to flee, to stay, to isolate themselves, to prevent the plague from spreading to neighbouring communities. And they agreed. They drew a boundary around Highjump and did not cross it. Food and supplies were left at the border by outsiders. Payment placed in vinegar filled holes in stones to disinfect the coins. For 14 months, the people of Highjump lived in self-imposed quarantine. Families buried their own dead. Neighbours watched each other sicken and die. Out of a population of around 350, approximately 260 died. But the plague did not spread beyond Highjump. The surrounding villages were spared. It is a story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. A story that asks a question that echoes across the centuries. What do we owe to each other in a time of plague? The Black Death posed that question in the most brutal terms imaginable, and the answers were varied. Some fled, abandoning their neighbours, their families, even their children. Some stayed and helped, knowing it might cost them their lives. Some blamed, scapegoated, murdered. Some prayed. Some danced. Some despaired. Humanity revealed itself in all its complexity, its cruelty and its compassion, its cowardice and its courage. And in many ways, we are still answering that question. In 2020, the world faced a pandemic again. Not plague, but COVID-19. Not Yersinia pestis, but SARS-CoV-2. The scale was different. The mortality rate was lower. The medical response was far more advanced. We had vaccines, ventilators, antibiotics for secondary infections, ICU beds, contact tracing. But the fundamental experience, the fear, The uncertainty, the disruption, the grief was eerily familiar. We saw cities locked down, borders closed, hospitals overwhelmed. We saw people dying alone, unable to say goodbye to their loved ones. We saw healthcare workers pushed to the breaking point. We saw misinformation spread as fast as the virus. We saw conspiracy theories, denial, blame. We saw some people make enormous sacrifices to protect others, and some refuse even the smallest inconvenience. We saw the same questions the medieval world faced. How do we balance individual freedom and collective safety? How do we maintain hope when the future is uncertain? How do we find meaning in suffering? And we saw the same truth the Black Death revealed, that we are connected, that a disease in one place can become a disease everywhere. That isolation is impossible in a globalized world. The plague traveled the Silk Road, carried by fleas on rats on ships. COVID-19 traveled airline routes, carried by people in planes. The speed was different, but the pattern was the same. And the lesson, perhaps, is the same as well. Pandemics are not anomalies. They are not once in a lifetime events. They are part of the fabric of existence, woven into the relationship between humans and the microbial world we inhabit. There have always been plagues, and there will always be plagues. The Black Death, smallpox, cholera, influenza, HIV/AIDS, Ebola, COVID-19. Each one teaches us something about fragility, about interdependence, about the limits of our control. But each one also teaches us something about resilience, because here is the other truth the Black Death reveals: we survive. Europe lost a third to half its population. The trauma was unimaginable. The suffering was immense, but life continued. Children were born, fields were planted, cities were rebuilt, art was created, knowledge was preserved and passed on. The survivors mourned, but they also loved. They grieved, but they also hoped. They remembered the dead, but they chose to live. And from the ruins of the old world, a new world emerged, not perfect, not utopian, but different, changed. The plague did not break humanity. It bent it. It tested it. It forced adaptation, innovation, transformation. And in that transformation, there is a kind of hope. Not the naive hope that catastrophe can be avoided, but the harder, deeper hope that catastrophe can be endured, that even in the darkest times there is light, that even in the midst of death there is life. The people of Iam chose to stay. They chose to sacrifice themselves so that others might live. It is an extreme example, but it points to something fundamental in human nature: the capacity for compassion, for courage, for selflessness. That capacity exists alongside the cruelty and the fear. Both are real. Both are part of who we are. And the question the plague poses, what do we owe to each other, is not a question with a single answer. It is a question each generation must answer anew. Each individual must answer in their own time and place. As the night deepens and the stories of the dead fade into the quiet, there is a final image worth holding. It is an image of a village, not Iam, not any specific place, but a composite of all the villages and towns and cities that endured the plague. The streets are empty now. The bodies have been buried. The fires have burned out. But in a window there is a candle, just one, a small flickering light in the darkness, and inside a family. A mother, a father, a child. Survivors. They are tired. They are grieving. They are scarred by what they have lived through. But they are together. And tomorrow, they will wake and begin again. They will plant a seed. They will bake bread. They will tell a story. They will sing a song. They will do the ordinary, sacred work of living. And in that work, in that choice to continue, there is defiance. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet and steadfast. The plague took so much, but it did not take everything. It did not take the capacity to love, to hope, to endure. And that, perhaps, is the lesson that remains. That we are fragile, that we are mortal, that we are vulnerable to forces beyond our control, but also that we are resilient, that we are creative, that we are capable of finding meaning and beauty even in the midst of suffering. The Black Death is history now. A chapter closed, a story told, but its echoes linger in the way we think about disease, about society, about mortality, in the art we create and the questions we ask, and in the simple, enduring truth that life goes on. The candle flickers, the child sleeps, and outside, in the darkness, the stars turn slowly overhead, indifferent and eternal, while below, the human world, broken, battered, but undefeated, breathes and dreams and begins again. Rest now. The story is told. The dead are remembered, and the living, as they always have, carry on